Book 2 The World is Changing. Chapter 1 Summer of the African Invader. The previous year was a breakout year for the One-Eyed Jacks in North America, beginning with their hugely successful opening at the new casino in Las Vegas, the Volcano. They opened to rave reviews which sent their international popularity soaring as well. The success of the Volcano was primarily due to the Caldera Arena hosting the amazing performances of the One-Eyed Jacks. Additional celebrities were brought in from all entertainment venues as well as the world of sports, albeit American sports. I talked with Marius shortly after the opening to congratulate them, and he invited Cheesy and I to join them in Los Angeles for their appearance on The Vile Tongue, a late-night talk show hosted by the Poison Voice. Cheesy and I knew of the Poison Voice primarily through his offspring, Heidi and Holly, the twins that played a fabulously mean trick on Richard back in our Ridgeway days. He's known as the Poison Voice with the Vile Tongue, but his stage name is Hylia Toxic and his girls are known as the Toxic Twins. Cheesy looked up his birth name through his internet connections and it was actually recorded as Clarence Dawkins. We thought he was probably supposed to be named Clarence, but somebody spelled the name wrong on his birth certificate. His announcer and sidekick co-host was a fellow who went by the name of Extremely Lucky, and occasionally the Toxic Twins would make an appearance on the show to keep their social media fresh. Social media was the only thing they had going for them in those days after having a failed clothing line and a cosmetic company that was sued for testing on animals, according to Cheesy. Who does that these days? I asked him. The Toxic Twins, he said and shook his head. Cheesy and I took a flight to Los Angeles from Hobart, which was actually the first time on that route for me. Cheesy had made the trip to Los Angeles several times, but my only other venture to California was through San Diego. Los Angeles was uniquely different from San Diego, and according to Cheesy, San Francisco, being further north, was different again. It was spring in California when we arrived in Los Angeles for a 2-day trip to join up with the Jacks for their TV show appearance. It seemed like a lot of hustle and bustle and was rather fast-paced for my liking, but I can only imagine the Jacks' lifestyle. Cheesy and I took a taxi from the airport to the Los Angeles Hilton, where we met up with the Jacks just a few hours before the live show. It was increasingly more difficult for the Jacks to move around in the world of celebrities, so we had a bit of a reunion at the hotel before being picked up by a limo to go to the show. I had my first taste of paparazzi who had learned that the Jacks were in the hotel. Marius told us the European paparazzi were 10 times more aggressive than their American counterparts. We leave the paparazzi to Darla usually. She has them falling head over heels, down escalators and even into fountains. Remember that guy she startled and he spilled a whole tray of half-cap lattes on himself. He still had to follow her with a crotch full of coffee. Marion said to Marius, who couldn't help laughing. The Jacks were a phenomenal success in the US at that time, riding a huge wave of popularity, and that made it impossible for them to join us in Africa later this year. Marius, Marion, and Darla were touring the various late-night talk shows on both coasts as well as the European shows. They also showed up at important events to be photographed in Las Vegas, Reno, Nashville, New York, and Los Angeles. They still had to find time to perform in addition to all of the media demands. With a schedule like that, they could only spend 2 weeks performing on the Riviera last year and spend whatever spare time they had at the Salton Sea because it was quick access. They did miss Castle Sel Traded, but such was the life of the circus performer. We arrived at the show venue only to be hustled past the waiting paparazzi into the building and deposited in a room they called the Green Room. The Jacks had to get dressed for their performance, so they were escorted elsewhere. This just happened to be a night when the Toxic Twins were on the show, and there they were sitting cross-legged in the Green Room when we entered. It was obvious that they had their sights set on meeting the Jacks, so basically ignored us knowing we weren't Marius and Marion. Cheesy and I went into invisibility mode, and the twins had no idea who Cheesy and I were, but we certainly knew them by sight. While waiting in the room, they made small talk with each other, and we didn't divulge anything more at that point. As soon as the Jacks entered, the demeanor changed and they obviously had their eyes set on the Jacks. Later we told Marius and Marion that we knew them from our school days and recanted the Richard story. Someday I'll hear the Richard story firsthand from at least one of those elusive nuns. Cheesy vowed. A young lady with a microphone strapped to her face entered the room and told the Jacks they were on in 1 minute. The Jacks got up to go and Marion turned to Cheesy and said, "You're gonna like this one." Marius stood stage left while Marion waited stage right. The Poison Voice took center stage waiting for the camera to return from the commercial break. Hylia earned his name by spewing out some of the vilest venom found between the pages of the American English Dictionary. When he couldn't find the appropriate word, he invented it himself. This was television tonight and he had to tone it down from his live stage act. Tonight, he was going to ply his trade on the One-Eyed Jacks and push the live television envelope to the Janet Jackson level. That was a fatal mistake, although I do believe his destiny was already sealed on that night. Tonight, I'd like you to welcome a fabulous new act taking Las Vegas by the short hairs. The one-eyed jack-offs, and before he could even raise his hands to welcome the jacks, the crowd began to boo him. He was likely thinking at that point that it was a major victory for him. The crowd's animosity then fueled his vile and he began making lewd gestures towards the audience as he awaited the jacks. TV cameras were only catching what could be broadcast. The jacks appeared, unfazed by his comments, and approached him from either side of the stage with their arms wide open and big smiles on their faces. They were dressed in lavish circus outfits and looked amazing as they moved to center stage in their swelling capes. Each placed a hand on the back of Hylier's neck and each shook a hand. Marion bent down and whispered in his ear. Immediately the jacks stepped back and away from the poison voice, leaving him standing in the spotlight staring into the camera like a deer caught in the headlights. He didn't move, so the camera came in for a close-up. The heat of the lights was making him sweat profusely, and then suddenly a look of extreme fear came over his face as his bowels and bladder emptied out onto the stage and he was left standing in a huge puddle of his own output. The smell of the contents of 10 feet of intestine stuffed with aged Taco Bell didn't go over well with the first 5 rows of the audience, who began choking, gagging, and throwing up. The cameras from the studio were shut off quickly and the station went to a long commercial break, but there were 50 or more cell phones that caught all of the action and were posting to the net immediately. One video Cheesy found on the internet later to show Errol had 9 different people projectile vomiting in the audience. I'm not sure what they showed on the channel in the meantime because Cheesy and I were still in the green room and the jacks were apparently waiting to go on stage to perform, but the crew had to clean up all the crap and vomit first. The Toxic twins left the green room to find out what happened to their father. When the show resumed, the first 5 rows were emptied and the rest of the crowd was going wild, especially when the jacks retook the stage to perform their act. The act they had planned required 2 keyboards to be placed in the center of the stage back to back. One was set up for the left hand and one for the right hand. 2 bubble projection machines were placed in between the jacks and the audience. The lights dimmed and the audience went silent. Spotlights hid the jacks and the machines. Marius was playing the keyboard with his right hand and in his left hand was a glove with a whip device built into it. He snapped it for effect prior to beginning just to show the audience what it was. Marion had the same setup, but with his left hand on the keyboard and his right held the gloved whip, which he gave an initial snap to the audience. The song they had chosen for their trick was the classic Tiny Dancer by Elton John. A song which begins slow and then climbs to a crescendo, exactly as the crowd would. Marius played the first few notes with his right hand, and when he triggered one note in particular, a red bubble would be ejected from the machine, which he would then snap down with the whip in his left hand and sparks would fall down and expire. Marion played the next few notes, and again when he hit a particular note a blue bubble was ejected that he had to snap it out of the air with his right hand. A fine mist of water seemed to fall as the bubble was popped. The boys switched leads on the keyboard every time a ball came up. The song began to pick up pace and the balls began coming out faster with multiple balls for multiple notes. Spectators in the audience were screaming with glee as the bubbles burst over their heads and the effects rained down. They reached a fevered crescendo, and then as the song ended, the jacks bowed to the audience, the lights were cut and they exited by their respective wings. With the jacks finished their act, they came by the green room to get Cheesy and I, and we left by a helicopter from the roof of the studio without even changing from their costumes. The helicopter took us back to the Hilton and we were inside our suite without seeing a single paparazzi. I asked Marion what he whispered to Hylia Toxic before the big fiasco and he responded, 1 word. Gaboon. Marius told us, a bite from a gaboon viper causes symptoms like rapid swelling, intense pain, and shock, but other symptoms include defecation, urination, swelling of the tongue and eyelids, convulsions, and unconsciousness. Florin is a genius at extracting some of the proteins or enzymes from the venom to create just the specific effect he wants. In this case, the bladder dumping events without the more dangerous effects of the venom. He had to wait for us to stop laughing to continue. The toxins were in our rings. Each ring had one of 2 components necessary to envenomate the voice and a tiny needle that we exposed when we wanted to be. And Cheesy asked, what happens if you prick yourself? Quote, if we were to accidentally inject ourselves with our rings, nothing would happen because you need both components of the formula. They mix in the target's bloodstream, which takes a few seconds. The hot light sped it up even faster tonight. I'm sure Florin caught that if he was watching the show. Marion added, Florin told me there are 35 proteins of significant molecular mass in gaboon viper venom. He can split them up between about a dozen toxin families and then brew up his various concoctions. Some of these formulas go back centuries and others are more recent. Florin creates the effect he wants and then ramps up the effect and wraps it in an implementation strategy. He makes these things foolproof and safe for us too. From my schooling I knew snake venoms were complex mixtures of enzymes and proteins. I made a mental note to talk to Florin about this and find out how he did it. This wasn't taught in any schools. Bacteria was involved as a catalyst, I'll bet. Right now, I thought, let's just enjoy the shit hittin' the fans. Marius added, Florin may have brewed this in the cell traded lab, but he told me he got this particular formula from a friend of his in the Bulgarian Secret Service. There was so much more to Florin than met the eye, and I made a mental note to find out what that was. We spent the rest of the evening talking about everything from the Salton Sea to things we were doing in Tasmania, as well as everyone we mutually knew. It was a great reunion with the Jacks, but the next morning came too quickly and they had the helicopter take us all to the airport. Marius and Marion were off to meet Darla in New York for a week and we had to return to Tasmania. I knew Cheesy would have liked to take a week in New York, but we had lots of chores waiting for us back in Tas if we were going to Africa this summer. I had a chance to speak with Carl about his involvement in the Pendulum Group shortly after the meeting. His role included managing the finances of the Pendulum Group around the world. Ian had asked him to manage the Windhaven plc trust as well, and he was involved in all of the Salton Sea finances. The empire was building on an international scale, and moving large funds around the world through various governments was no simple task. Additionally, Ian told me patents were going to become very important to us in the future, so Carl was building a team of patent lawyers with international skills. Carl is the best in the world at moving money to where we need it. In this day and age of terrorist financing and global government corruption, it's truly a feat of magic to remain inconspicuous. He has the trust of Uncle Sandu and Sandy as well, which both mean a lot to me. Branching out to handle patent issues is going to be key if our Tesla search bears any real fruit. Your Uncle David certainly gave you a financial angel to look after you. When the Windhaven responsibilities of Sir Malcolm Havelock were split after his death, Dr. Ben became responsible for the day-to-day operations while working with Carl on the financial requirements. Windhaven funds were growing through its investments in the Salton Sea project and the funds left by Sir Malcolm. Project scopes were expanding to take into consideration the new technology that could now be brought on site. I was hoping Magda would come to Africa with us this summer, but she decided to go with Krista to spend the summer on the Duchess Island. The Duchess promised to take them to Hong Kong and show them around all of the best places. Darla planned to join him for that part of the trip and to meet the Duchess. That sounded like a great trip as well, and I wondered if Dad was even invited on that one. I said to Cheesy, it's nice to have so many great options when you're independently wealthy. Uncle Sandu had finished building the Volcano Casino and Caldera Arena in Las Vegas, which were both open and operating now on their 3-year journey. That gave him the opportunity to focus his attention on the Salton Sea builds the cell tradeds planned for the longer term, but before that, he decided to take the summer off and return to Moldavia for a couple months. Ian told me Uncle Sandu said he wanted to return to hunt down some books one of his people located that might be coming up for sale in Prague this summer. Alexei and April were home at Castle Cell Tradit on vacation from the University of Moscow for the summer. Alexei was working on a physics degree and April was earning her engineering degree. A new physicist was hired by the Pendulum Group to work on special projects with Florin arising from the Tesla research. She was Dr. Rosny Gregorine, previously of the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology. She was extremely well regarded in several fields of energy research. I was looking forward to hearing more about her from Florin and Alexei, who was working with her as much as he could. That would certainly help him in his university studies. Ian informed me that General Alexei Anupov had the same issues as Dick with respect to committing to the Pendulum Group. However, the general will be retiring later this year and will be able to commit fully to the Pendulum Group at that time. His contacts in the Soviet Union should prove essential in trying to track down the phage research Dr. Sue's looking for. Ian also let me know, General Anupov has information on several Soviet top-secret projects working to extend life. One in particular took a lot of traction just prior to the Soviet breakup. It was known as Project Immortal. I was shocked when he told me about the wolves around Castle Cell Tradit being early remnants of that project. I also learned that Florin was spending a lot of time at the Tesla Museum. He had become fast friends with the owners of the documents and was able to research all of the material available as well as gain access to anything and everything available. Much of what he had learned required additional research beyond a causal physicist, and that's why Dr. Roz was brought on. Ian told me they have some very interesting patents that Tesla either never got to register or had been removed from the registers in the countries they were registered in. Several were actually reassigned to different people, and that's why establishing the patents would be essential. Florin's been traveling to small towns in Siberia to meet with General Anupov to locate several Russian doctors who were working on phage projects prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union. With their funding gone in most cases, their data is the only thing of value keeping him alive. This could provide a great opportunity for Dr. Sue and the Windhaven crew to acquire the data as well as the knowledge extracted from it to date. Whenever a trip to an exotic destination like Africa or India was contemplated, months of preparation were required, getting shots and picking up prescriptions. This time I was far more familiar with where I was going and what facilities would be available to me when I got there. Knowing that allowed me to pack items of use not only by myself but by everyone in camp. Those included a variety of medical supplies that are considered over-the-counter in Australia but were very difficult for Dr. Ben to acquire locally. I didn't have to study the myriad of things that could kill me because I had met most of them the last time I was in Africa. Cheesy and Errol were with me on this trip, and as usual Cheesy had Errol worked up in a tizzy about the dangers of lions, scorpions, and snakes. But those are nothing compared to the witch doctors with their catingers and bags with faces on them hanging from their waists. Don't piss those guys off, mate. Our business in Tasmania was starting to take shape with a few important clients and each of us making significant progress with our respective doctorates. We purchased a couple of acres on the River Derwent and Uncle Artis constructed a lab building for us as well as another building to live in on site. He was looking for a used boat, but that was not a high priority at the moment. When we left, Uncle Artis had just acquired the Halls Falls property that we wanted and hired Travis and Tamor to build some discreet camp buildings and a kennel. The idea was to keep the Anchor Road face looking like a residence rather than anything more. The boys would be mapping the place extensively with cameras to try and become familiar with the movements of the thylacines we know pass through the property. We've seen him, now we need to get a sample from them. They've been emailing Cheesy constantly about their camera and computer setups. Even Magda got into one conversation. We needed more than a picture, a hair sample would be great. Dick was able to get a month's leave and joined us for the first part of our summer in Africa. I'm sure the fact that Dr. Sue was there contributed to his desire to make the time. He seems to be enjoying his military assignment, but unfortunately, he can't reveal any of that to us. We met up with him at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi and he promised to bring us up to date on the Salton Sea at the fire later. Naturally, he was excited to get to Windhaven and see Dr. Sue. We could now officially call Ian, Dr. Ian, as he had met all the basic requirements necessary, but still had some loose ends to attend to at McMaster Hospital in Canada. This trip to Africa was to prepare him to stay on a semi-permanent basis as soon as those obligations were complete. We both knew we had lots of time to talk things over during the next couple of months, so we left it at that. On this trip we were staying at Ian's father's house, which was going to be his principal residence upon relocation. Cheesy, Errol and I were barely through customs when Ian showed up with his friend Martin, who was again flying us to his landing strip near Bangale, just 20 kilometers from Windhaven. I was going to miss the drive in Sir Malcolm's car, but Ian told me, we sold the car to an African prince who can afford to have the dents removed monthly. It's actually a very interesting story, I must tell you some night. Sandy and Rick were flying in from India, but were not expected for another 12 hours, so we went on to Windhaven without them. Ian led us to the small plane waiting to take us on another experience in a 6-seater only a few hundred feet above the ground. Errol hadn't been in a small plane like this before and Cheesy and I continued to comment on what shade of green we thought he was turning. It was Angus and Jeffrey who met us at Martin's hangar when we landed. We climbed into the two vehicles they brought and left Martin's hangar to make our way along the familiar dusty road to Windhaven. The short journey was made shorter by the brisk conversation of everyone trying to catch up at once. The last time I arrived at Windhaven I was shocked by the simple design of the camp with respect to other homes in Ian's family. This time was no different. As we approached the principal residence of Windhaven I could see it was considerably more elegant by African standards but still rather austere by English standards. A one-floor open concept with lots of windows filtering breeze through the house at all angles. The windows of course had screens to keep out the unfriendly neighbors and the gardens featured large shade trees all around the house. Wind chimes hung from every space that offered them a perch and they seemed to play their tunes on cue. The home had a grand facade with a covered entrance where large trees offered shade to those waiting to come in. Ian told us, the Mutunguru tree is believed to be the tallest tree in Kenya, but after the Intandrophragma excelsum, which is the tallest tree in Africa growing in the Kilimanjaro Valley of Tanzania. They have a stand there of specimens over 80 meters tall. Those may not be tall by your standards, Errol, but around here that's big. Once through the double front doors, a large room opened and presented itself to the visitor. A very definite African motif struck the first-time visitor, featuring a large circular fireplace in the middle of the room as the focal point. Hallways led to wings off each side of the massive room and crossed again at the back of the structure to form a large internal atrium and conservatory. The home had 3 full-time employees available to meet the whims and wishes of the lord of the manor. In this case, Ian's father, who really was a lord. There was plenty of room at Windhaven, so once we were settled into our respective accommodations, we joined Ian in the atrium garden to have tea and wait for Sandy and Rick to arrive. Ian told Cheesy and I that one of the things he wanted to look into while we were at Windhaven was the cluster of rocks and the cave that he and Jay found on the property. It's located on the land that Sir Malcolm left to my father. It extends Windhaven to the north by several kilometres. Rick's brought some additional documents I asked him to bring from India that refer to Sir Malcolm and Lord Andrew's involvement with an American doctor, but I'll leave that till Rick arrives. Eventually Sandy and Rick were dropped off at Ian's house by Geoffrey and Hamish, who continued on to the labs. We spent the next hour or two getting reacquainted and consuming the meal Ian had his housekeeper prepared for us. During dinner we received information that the Jacks would not be able to join us. After dinner we journeyed over to the Windhaven camp, which was about a kilometre away along a well-groomed road which, of course, had wind chimes dangling from all of the best trees along the way. With dusk setting in we were issued large flashlights with several different settings depending on our situation. When we were children, this stroll with father was magical. Each wind chime had a name and could signal fairies and forest spirits. My sisters would dress like fairies in long white gowns with wreaths of olive branches in their hair. Our nanny even made them each wands to enhance their personae. Each sister was a very specific fairy with a name, history, appearance and of course, a magical skill. If Sir Malcolm were at Windhaven, he would tell a story as we walked. For this trip it was usually a story of the wee people of Ireland and his good friend Malachi Machuge. I always wondered if Malachi was so big that the wee people were in fact just normal-sized people, but I didn't ruin the illusion for my sisters. Richard always straggled 50 meters behind, totally uninterested in the ridiculous fantasies of girls, as he put it. Father would have torches set out along the path as we journeyed back after dark. The chimes would be playing the music of the fairies talking as they flew on the wind. Ian told us, if this path were in Oxford and we were strolling along on an evening such as Ian did that night, I would have been thinking of Shelley or Tolkien, not venomous snakes, scorpions, and everything else that goes bump in the night and which was watching me from a distance at this very moment. Sandy mentioned he'd been talking with the Jacks and Uncle Sandu about their casino plans for the Salton Sea. Only native tribes are allowed to build and operate their own gambling establishments in California. The casino must be placed within the borders of their reservation lands, so the current casino in the Salton Sea area isn't in violation of casino laws, it's free to stay. Red Earth Casino is owned by the Torres Martinez Desert Cahuilla Group, and their landholdings are not one continuous area, but rather a series of areas intermingled within the land available to the general public. I think that's rather unusual, however I haven't researched their history in the area. In fact, the berm crossing over from Hoy 111 to Hoy 86 protecting the north end of the sink can bypass all reservation land. In addition, the berm will preserve the status of any of their holdings being above or below the current water level, which could have been a huge bone of contention and even delayed or changed things because that's the deepest part of the sink. It made me think how even a sure thing can be sitting on a knife's edge. That news started the Jacks and Uncle Sandu considering other possible options involving gambling at their hotel and circus complex. Carl suggested, set up your own ADW. Sandy went on to say, when Uncle Sandu asked for clarification, Carl explained his idea to us. Advanced deposit wagering is a type of betting system where a client funds an account that they can place wagers from. From there, the host offers the client opportunities to wager the funds they have on deposit. Horses, sports, even casino-type wagers like slot machines are all available by video terminal or simply through their account on the internet. I remember Marius saying, we still have them when they're at home. The net's going to bring them back to us on the Salton Sea. How does it make us money, Sandy? I asked. Sandy scanned his memory for a moment to find a good example and then said, let's take a horse race for example. Mr. Cheesy here decides to bet $100 to win on Romanian Beauty at 20 to 1. We send Mr. Cheesy's bet to the host track in perhaps Canada. If Mr. Cheesy's bet wins, his account will be debited with the exact amount due him according to the track payout. If Mr. Cheesy loses his bet, then he receives nothing. Regardless of the outcome to Mr. Cheesy, the track will send us an amount equal to the race, take out less taxes and royalties. That usually runs around 15% of what Mr. Cheesy bet. Actually, the more Mr. Cheesy wins, the better for us because he keeps betting and we keep taking another 15%. For us, he can keep betting the same money over and over and we keep winning. I thought, Ian is so right about Carl. What a genius he is. And how lucky am I that he's looked out for me since I was a child. Aren't you working on something at the Salton Sea with Carl too? I asked Sandy and he replied, yes, we're going to build an underwater amusement park for snorkelers and divers. We've been meeting with the local authorities and some state government officials that Dick's people arranged for us. We want to acquire the rights to about 30 acres in the southeast corner of the projected new sea boundaries based on where the berm ends. All the land is currently above the water level, so we want to begin construction as soon as possible. Dr. Su has sourced us some great corals that will grow on the structures and the statutes in the projected salinity of the water and within projected temperatures as the sea grows in volume. It's a bit of a tricky problem adding seawater and only losing moisture through evaporation. The corals are going to have to live through those changing conditions, so I believe the Red Sea is the source of those types of organisms. The whole area will be a reef for the wildlife that will be in the Salton Sea, as well as a tourist site to see a sunken ship or underwater city. Carl has left the design of the areas to me, so I've had some fun planning them out, but it's still very early. I should run them by you and Cheesy. You've always got an opinion and more than a bit of creativity. We arrived at the camp for a festive campfire with people we'd not seen for several years in some cases. Of course, Dick was there with Dr. Sue, whom we hadn't seen since New Year's Eve. She had some great projects underway that she wanted to update us on, but she also wanted to take a much-needed break to relax for at least one evening. Dick was doing his best to encourage that and discouraging us. Dr. Ben, of course, whom we had last seen in Tasmania over the summer, told us, "Half my time is spent managing Windhaven, which leaves me less time for research. However, with the addition of the grad students and the improved resources, I think I can manage both. What I can't do is get a foothold in CRISPR," he told us, but in fact, his research turned out to be impacted more by the time he'd been spending with his CRISPR addition than anything else. I realized it was not only Dr. Sue that had an addictive personality. I thought his expertise on spiders would be needed at some point on this trip, and he had to accompany us to the spider site Ian wanted us to visit. This had to be our species for the neonatal formula, or why else would it be here? Too many coincidences. The next to arrive at the bonfire was Jay, who took a seat and let us know right away what she'd been working on, which was almost exclusively with Dr. Emily Kenyatta. I've traveled over most of Kenya in the last year talking to Kikuyu families and collecting DNA samples wherever possible. Family details and information about ancestors are important data points for Dr. Emily's research. She's trying to piece together relationships over time, she told us. Understanding DNA is a difficult task in itself, but understanding how it changes over time is an exponentially complicated concept that even scientists don't know yet. Carrying large handfuls of wood, the next to arrive were Jeffrey and Cheesy, already getting together to install some major changes to the Windhaven file and web servers. Cheesy had a plan they code-named the Windhaven Poacher Alert Program, which required improved web server access on a live basis so people could connect to cameras located around Windhaven, monitoring all sites for poaching 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. New cameras, routers, and extenders were purchased to maximize live monitoring, and, on this trip, we were all helping to install them. The animals needed our help, especially the rhinos. Patrons from around the world were willing to pay for the privilege of being responsible for monitoring an area of land in Africa to personally fight poaching. They were scheduled for a block of time to watch for poachers or suspicious activities. That may be seen as intrusive by North American or European standards, but the areas in question belonged to Windhaven and were migration paths in many cases. The savanna locations like Windhaven were ideal for this type of monitoring, and infrared at night could be used effectively at a distance. The patrons would be able to notify local authorities of any issues or concerns through the website software, and a local team would respond in real time to try to prevent the incident if they deemed it were necessary. This was being set up at Windhaven, so Kim and Jeffrey were the local authority who would respond. Infrared cameras that provided a view of heat signatures moving about the land were located on poles and could be rotated 360 degrees by the viewer. There was some slick advertising done on the internet, and the One-Eyed Jacks even gave it several plugs through their media channels. This wasn't ideal for everywhere in Africa, but here it was. Funds earned by the Windhaven Poacher Alert Program were being directed to improving water resources in the areas they covered for both people and animals. Some locals had to travel kilometers every day just to get drinking water, but this was not an easy problem to solve in this part of the world. Cheesy inherited one thing from Count Laszlo, his desire to implement security. He often referred to his friends in New York and their elite hacking skills, which translated to elite security skills. When he mentions his friend Lorenzo, you know he's in seriously deep. Lorenzo is the best, and according to Cheesy, if you have to add a distinction, then he isn't the best. I didn't know if Lorenzo was his real name or not, but I was sure he must be the best if Cheesy said so. Plans were being made to take this technology to more difficult areas of Africa where poaching was a bigger problem at that point and the government was turning a blind eye. Several of those areas were in conflict or were all-out war zones, so protecting the cameras would be considerably more difficult and doing anything about it most likely impossible. Drone technology was being considered, but their use could create serious reservations with regards to spying, and they would simply be target practice. Who would respond in the middle of a war to save one rhino? You. The last rhino. Still no. Kim and Big Wham entered the growing circle of light as night drew in on us and the fire expanded and grew brighter. Big Wham was holding Baby Goo's hand as they entered the glow from the fire, and Kim carried a large jug of his homemade beer, Muratina. Nothing like fermented sausage fruit, cheesy? Jeffrey asked as he poked him. Kim told us he was looking forward to Cheesy's return and the implementation of the new anti-poaching potential of the website. A Chinese businesswoman has offered a 500% increase in the price she's willing to pay for rhinoceros horn. She doesn't even care what species. That type of bounty will surely make the risk of being caught worth it for many people in remote areas. He told us. You cannot put your mind in a place where your country is the site of war, you've lost half of your family and your children need to be fed. Can you put your mind there? That's the other part of this program, because the funds will be going to local projects to counter poaching opportunities where we can. Creating a better environment for people and perhaps some gainful employment along the way. Big Wham was making progress on her career since receiving a grant from the Kenyan government to study several species of plant from the higher slopes of Mount Kenya. As she showed on our last trip, some of the plants have exceptional longevity. Dr. Ben had given her a small area of the new lab being set up for the grad students. I thought to myself, another project extending life. Perhaps if we fix some of the imbalances of this life, then living longer will be more appealing to all. Baby Goo had sprouted up since the last time I saw her, growing at least a meter. I wondered what the experience would be as a child growing up in this environment instead of the one I experienced in Switzerland. She was looking forward to the campfire and meeting all the people she had heard about, knew her but she couldn't remember meeting. Wham and Angus were back from the University of Nairobi, where they were both studying biology, and both brought armloads of wood with them and dropped it as they entered the circle. Angus was living in Sir Malcolm's bungalow at Windhaven with his brother. Hamish displayed an aptitude for computer technology and was working closely with Jeffrey as his apprentice. Jeffrey himself was becoming quite an expert under the personal tutelage of Cheesy. Dr. Emily and her son Little Joe joined the fire, accompanied by the 3 Windhaven grad students. We were informed by Dr. Emily that she was able to bring Little Joe to work with her every day. In fact, Little Joe is part of our study trying to prove there's a difference in the vital force of a person based on their age and when their vital force was acquired. At least that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Her work was going to be expanded to the study of changing DNA down the line. At the moment, Jay and her were collecting data and building upon relationships, but Dr. Emily was concerned about external influences on the changes to DNA. I can see where her work will fit in with our DNA work and will eventually require the services of Cheesy for analysis. Environmental changes impacting DNA can create different phenotypes of the same DNA package delivered. The new grad students were assigned to Windhaven primarily to aid Dr. Sue's project, which was taking the most focus at Windhaven currently, according to Ian. There were 3 students assigned to Dr. Sue, Joan, Jane, and Jim, or the J crew, as Hamish called them when they came together with Jeffrey or even Little Joe. All 3 were biology students from Nairobi working toward their graduate degrees. Dr. Sue introduced him to us. This is Joan van der Plaat, originally hailing from Johannesburg, Jane Todd arriving from London in jolly old England, and Jim Kenyatta, born and raised locally here in Kenya. They'll be joining us for the summer to help implement several major tests for our project. Hopefully these projects will provide some light and continue on into the new year. Something didn't seem right to me about Ms. Todd. People who are always looking out of their peripheral vision can only be looking for something they aren't supposed to see. Whether it's an opportunity for an advantage or a warning of impending doom for the paranoid, neither thought leaves a smile on the thinker's face, and either thought can be a catalyst for swinging someone's pendulums. Now that everyone was here and the introductions were over, we sang a few camp songs until the youngest was sound asleep and carried off home to dream the dreams of the innocent. This was the perfect opportunity for Cheesy to ask, Sandy, have you got a new story for us to start this trip off? And Sandy replied, have you heard the story of King Shantanu, Cheesy G? I have not, Swami Sandy, please enlighten me. Those of us who were familiar with Sandy's storytelling skills settled in for an epic adventure from Hindu mythology. They weren't the same as Sir Malcolm's stories of tigers and colonial India, but Sandy could hold his audience just as well as Sir Malcolm was able to and didn't need the stick to smack any shins. Shantanu was a king of the Kuru kingdom living in its capital city Hastinapur, the city of elephants on the banks of the Ganges. He was a descendant of the Bharata race and a member of the lunar dynasty of the Kshatriya Varna. Who on earth were they, Sandy mate? Errol asked. The lunar dynasty was a principal house of the Kshatriyas Varna. They were kings of a warrior caste mentioned in the ancient Indian texts. This particular dynasty was said to be descended from moon deities. The Kurukshetra war, in the epic Mahabharata, was fought between rival branches of the lunar dynasty. Krishna was believed to be born to the Yajavansh branch of the lunar dynasty, which was pretty much wiped out in the war documented in the Mahabharata. Krishna was an avatar of Vishnu. Shantanu was a great-grandfather of the Pandava and Kaurava clans, who eventually became the focus of the Mahabharata. He was the youngest son of King Pratipa of Hastinapur, said to be old by the time Shantanu was born. But Shantanu's story begins well before that. It's the result of two separate curses. The first curse was cast by sage Vasishtha. The Vasus were a group of deities associated with fire and light. In the Mahabharata they were known as the sons of Manu and a daughter of Daksha named Vasu. They were 8 among the 33 gods. The Vasus, led by Prithu, were out enjoying themselves in the forest when Prabhasa's wife spotted a divine cow which tickled her fancy. She persuaded Prabhasa to steal the cow with the help of Prithu and his other brothers. Unfortunately for them, the cow was owned by the sage Vashishta. He cursed them to be born on earth as mortals, but responded to their pleading by promising that 7 of them would be free of mortality within a year, but Prabhasa would have to go full term. Sage Vashishta allowed him to choose Ganga as their mother. The second curse that ties into our story occurred between yugas as the earth was being reformed. In his day, Mahabhisha possessed many virtuous qualities. He was a king of the Ikshvaku dynasty, which were descendants of the sun. The sun was the god and originator. Together with the lunar dynasty, they were the main lineages of the Kshatriya Varna. He was the firstborn of Himayat, the personification of the Himalayas, and sister to mother goddess Parvati. In this existence he was known as Mahabhisha. Mahabhisha had performed 1,000 Ashvamedha yajnas, or horse sacrifices, and 100 Rajasuya yajnas, the great sacrifice. That earned him an opportunity to attain Brahmaloka after his death on earth. While the world was being reformed for the next yuga, he received the opportunity to spend time with Brahma, the gods and the devas including Ganga, in heaven. As Ganga was dancing, a wind blew through, causing a revealing rustle of her clothes. Everyone averted their eyes except Mahabhisha and Ganga. Brahma lost his temper and cursed Mahabhisha and Ganga to be born as mortals. The worst possible fate. He softened the load for Ganga because he was more offended by Mahabhisha. Ganga could return to heaven on one condition: you can only come back here after you break Mahabhisha's heart. To set her plans in motion, Ganga needed to approach King Pratipa, who was sitting in the lotus position meditating. She took the form of a beautiful woman and approached the king by sitting on his right thigh. When the king asked her what she wanted, Ganga requested he become her husband. King Pratipa had to refuse because he had taken a vow not to lust for anyone, and besides Ganga had sat on his right thigh, and everyone knew in those days that a man's right thigh was for his daughter and the left was for his wife. The king proposed she marry his son, which in this case was Shantanu, and Ganga agreed. She agreed because Shantanu was the reincarnation of Mahabhisha, but she had one condition: never ask any questions about my actions. I guess she thought she could break his heart as either his mother or his wife. He couldn't yet become king because he had 2 older brothers. Devapi was the eldest son of King Pratipa of Hastinapura and oldest brother of Shantanu, who should have inherited the throne. Noble and well-liked, the prince was not allowed to succeed King Pratipa, because he was affected with leprosy, and the council of Brahmanas and elderly citizens were opposed to this proposal. Devapi became an immortal sage, retiring to the forest for penance along with the sage Maru. The realm of Kuru suffered from severe drought for 12 years. Devapi conducted yajnas to produce rain. It's said the sages remain alive until the end of Kali Yuga at a place called Kalapagrama. They will revive the Paurava dynasty in the next Satya Yuga. Perhaps they will visit Brahmaloka between yugas again, Sandy told us. Cheesy said, I'd best warn him it's a windy place. Balaka was the second of the 3 sons of King Pratipa and married Sananda. One account says that with his eldest son Devapi set to inherit, Pratipa gifted a parcel of newly conquered land to his second son. The land was given the name Balaka as a result. In another version, Balaka deserts his family to join with his uncle, who made him his heir and led to him becoming a king. Shantanu then became the crown prince, and upon King Pratipa's death, he became the king of Hastinapura, with Balika's blessing. Balaka ruled as king for many years and was the oldest warrior to fight in the Kurukshetra war. He fought on the side of the Kaurava army but was slain by Bhima on the 14th day of the war when it continued after sunset. According to Yudhishthira, Balika's only wish was that there should be peace among the Bharatas. On his coronation, he gave Yudhishthira a chariot of pure gold. Sambhava Parva of the Mahabharata recounts how when he touched the old men of his kingdom, they felt a sensation of pleasure which restored their youth. Ganga soon gave birth to their first son. She abruptly drowned the infant. King Shantanu could not ask the reason why she had done it, but it broke his heart. One by one, 7 sons were born, and 7 sons were drowned by Ganga. Why couldn't they stop her sooner? Errol asked, and Cheesy said, she's a queen. When Ganga was about to drown the eighth son, Shantanu was so devastated he could not restrain himself further and confronted her. Ganga explained to him Brahma's curse on Mahabisha and her. Then she revealed that their 8 children were the 8 Vasus cursed by Vashistha to be born on earth as mortal humans because they stole his cow. They partially pacified sage Vashistha, who limited his curse and told them that they would be freed from the curse within a year of their birth as humans except Prabhasa. The Vasus had requested Ganga to be their mother. Prabhasa was cursed to live a long life and would not have a wife or any children. The 8th son was the reincarnated Prabhasa. He was left to remain alive by Ganga, but imprisoned in his mortal form, in which he later became known as Bhishma, the great warrior. Sandy stopped for a drink and let some of the experienced listeners fill in gaps for the newcomers to Sandy's form of the fireside chat. The back chatter went on for 4 or 5 minutes. Cheesy asked Dick, does a great warrior have to remain single, Dick? And he received back a flurry of visual daggers. Sandy saved him by jumping back in. The sage Vashistha also gave a boon to him that the child who would be known as Devavrata would be virtuous, conversant with all the holy scriptures and an obedient son to his father. Ganga took him to train for the king's throne, which left King Shantanu consumed by grief thinking about spending the rest of his life without Ganga or any of his children. Shantanu adopted brahmacharya, a practice of celibacy and living within self that helped him rule his kingdom well. By merely adopting virtuous behavior, Shantanu was easily able to conquer the entire world without lifting any weapons. All the kings declared Shantanu as emperor, and he even gave up hunting to gain popularity with his subjects. One day, while walking along the banks of the Ganges, Shantanu saw that the river had become shallow, and that concerned him. While searching for the cause of the phenomenon, he came across a handsome young boy who had slowed the river's flow with his celestial weapon. The young boy knew he was his son. However, King Shantanu didn't recognize him because he hadn't set eyes on him since his birth. This was his 8th son Devavrata. The boy disappeared from his sight using his power of illusion. Perhaps he went to the same place Magda's pet peepers goes, I thought. Ganga appeared and revealed to him that the boy was actually his son Devavrata and that he had been taught the knowledge of the holy scriptures by the sage Vasistha and the art of warfare by Parshurama. She told Shantanu to take him to Hastinapura and name Devavrata as his heir. Shantanu was pained by his separation from Ganga but was overjoyed receiving such an accomplished son. He performed 7 Ashvamedha yajnas on the banks of the Yamuna with the help of Devavrata. 4 years later, Shantanu, while travelling near the banks of Yamuna, smelled a sweet scent coming from somewhere. While searching for the cause of the scent, he came across Satyavati, from whom the scent was emanating. Satyavati was an adopted daughter of the chief of the fishermen of her village. Upon seeing her, Shantanu fell in love with her and desired to marry her. Satyavati was a queen of the Kuru, wife of King Shantanu of Hastinapura, and great-grandmother of the Pandava and Kaurava princes. She began life as the daughter of a fisherman chieftain, Dashraja, but others say she was the daughter of the Chedi king Uparakara Vasu and a cursed Apsara, a celestial nymph, turned into a fish called Adrika. Satyavati was known as Matsyagandha, meaning, she who smells like fish. Satyavati met sage Parashara, who fathered her son Vyasa out of wedlock. The sage gave her a musky fragrance, earning her the name Gandhavati or Fragrant One. That's how she made Shantanu fall in love with her. Her father insisted Satyavati's son be king, but King Shantanu couldn't comply because Devavrata was his heir. Devavrata stepped forward and told the chief he would renounce all his claims in favor of Satyavati's children. He renounced his birthright for his father's happiness and took a vow of lifelong celibacy, brahmacharya. His father, King Shantanu, blessed him to live as long as he wanted to. That's when the Celestials renamed him Bhishma, meaning, one who has taken a terrible vow. Ah, there it is. Cheesy laughed. Satyavati bore Shantanu 2 sons, Chitringada and Vichitravriya. Her life goal and ambition was to ensure their succession and inheritance of the fortune. A lesson can be learned here. One should know where greed takes over from ambition. Upon King Shantanu's death, Vichitravriya became the king of Hastinapura because Chitringada had been killed by Gandharva while King Shantanu was still alive. Gandharva are those celestial beings, aren't they? The divine singers and dancers? Cheesy asked. Yes, that's them, Cheesy G, Sandy said. Chitringada was a great warrior who developed pride and began disrespecting everyone. Bhishma tried to correct his brother but was ignored and rendered powerless due to his oath to serve the Kuru kings. Chitringada died in battle before he could marry and have sons. A Gandharva also named Chitringada challenged him to a fight lasting 3 years. The Gandharva killed Chitringada. Bhishma performed the funeral ritual. Chitrangada's young brother Vichitravirya became king with Bhishma and Satyavati ruling in his stead. Much of Vichitravirya's life occurred after the story of King Shantanu. He was the youngest son of Queen Satyavati and King Shantanu, and a grandfather of the Pandavas and the Kauravas. His brother Chitrangada had no sons. When he reached manhood, Bhishma married Vichitravirya to Ambika and Ambalika, daughters of the king of Kashi. Vichitravirya fell ill and could not be healed. He died childless. So how is he a grandfather? Queen Satyavati asked her eldest son, sage Vyasa, born out of wedlock, to perform Nayoga with both the widows of her younger son Vichitravirya and one of their maids, Parashrami. Eventually they give birth to Dhritarashtra, Pandu and Vidura, respectively. Nayoga permitted one spouse who had no child to procreate a child with another woman or a man. Follow the DNA, I guess. One should know where greed takes over from ambition, Sandy concluded to rabid applause. He loved to have a moral to his stories. As many people drifted off to their beds, Dr. Sue enlightened us on some of her current thinking. There is a drug being used in the treatment of malaria due to Plasmodium falciparum in China that grows in a plant. Artemisinin is extracted from the plant Artemisia annua, sweet wormwood, an herb employed in Chinese traditional medicine. Artemisinin and its derivatives are all sesquiterpene lactones containing an unusual peroxide bridge. The endoperoxide 1,2,4-trioxane ring is responsible for their antimalarial properties. Few other natural compounds with such a peroxide bridge are known to exist. Artemisinin and its derivatives have the ability to kill faster and kill all the life cycle stages of the parasites, but low bioavailability, poor pharmacokinetic properties and high cost of the drugs are major drawbacks to their use. Signs are that malarial parasites are developing resistance to the drug. Therapies that combine artemisinin or its derivatives with some other antimalarial drugs are the preferred treatment for malaria, but I was thinking we may be able to extract the gene from the artemisinin DNA and insert it in another plant which has symbiotic properties. Researchers have created plant-human hybrid cells that could help reveal the extent to which evolution has conserved chromosome functions across the plant and animal kingdoms. Plant genes inserted into mosquito gametes. Then she changed her focus. We have to take on a couple more initiatives too to keep our grad students busy. Proteins are large biomolecules and macromolecules that have one or more long chains of amino acid residues. Biomolecules can be amino acids, sugars, nucleic acids, proteins, polysaccharides, DNA, and RNA which occur naturally in living organisms. Macromolecules, on the other hand, could be nucleic acids to store and transfer information or carbohydrates to store energy, provide fuel, or build structures. Perhaps it's a lipid to insulate and store fat or energy like a battery. It could even be a protein to provide structural support, transport, enzymes, movement, or even defense. All in all, a very versatile raw material. I've outlined several projects for the grad students to work on. We can go over them individually tomorrow, but in general we're looking at enzymes, which are proteins that speed up chemical reactions in our bodies. Build them up, break them down. Every living thing has enzymes, but they're also in manufactured products and food. They could definitely have an impact on dormant DNA gene sequences being activated by providing the protein required. Perhaps these modified proteins trigger latent diseases encoded in species DNA. Released by an enzyme the body had no intention of creating on this DNA path. Ian noted. Why does the presence of something in an environment increase the cancers in locals by 500%? He added rhetorically. Like fracking in Western Canada, for instance. Exactly, Ian. To know what enzymes trigger what genetic events to take place could be both a dangerous weapon as well as a helpful medical tool. DNA provides the code for the cell's activities, while RNA converts the code into proteins to carry out cellular functions. Proteins differ from one another primarily in their sequence of amino acids, which is dictated by the nucleotide sequence of their genes, resulting in proteins folding into specific 3D structures that determine all of their future activities. Dr. Ben added, many proteins are involved in the process of cell signaling and signal transduction. Some proteins, like insulin, are extracellular proteins. Insulin transmits a signal from the cell it was synthesized in, to other cells in distant tissue. Errol added, I've been looking into that actually. Membrane proteins are receptors whose main function is to bind a signaling molecule and induce a biochemical response in a cell. They fall into several broad categories depending on their location. Integral membrane proteins are a permanent part of a cell membrane and can either penetrate the membrane or associate with one of the sides of a membrane. Peripheral membrane proteins are transiently associated with the cell membrane. A third of all human proteins are membrane proteins, and those are targets for more than half of all drugs created by humans. Errol and I have spent a great deal of time considering peptides as potential agents to deliver inputs to the immune system to fight diseases they are made unaware of. I added that was our focus with the Tassie Devil at that moment in time. Dr. Ben added, nonetheless, compared to other classes of proteins, determining membrane protein structures remains a challenge in large part due to the difficulty in establishing experimental conditions that can preserve the correct conformation of the protein in isolation from its native environment. The localization of proteins in membranes can be predicted reliably using hydrophobicity analysis of protein sequences. Hydrophobicity analyses of protein sequences. Cheesy asked, to which Dr. Ben informed us, a hydrophobicity plot is a quantitative analysis of the degree of hydrophobicity of amino acids of a protein. It characterizes or identifies possible structure or domains of a protein. The plot has the amino acid sequence of a protein on its x-axis and degree of hydrophobicity on its y-axis. Actually, right up your alley, Cheesy. Perhaps we can look into this further before the summer ends. I knew that many receptors had a binding site exposed on the cell surface and an effector domain within the cell, which may have enzymatic activity or may undergo a conformational change detected by other proteins within the cell. That all seemed so Star Trek to me, with ships docking with other ships. These ones were in plasma, not space. We all slept in late the next day, and by the time I came into the atrium for breakfast, Sandy and Rick were already meditating in a sunny patch in the corner. Rick didn't participate with us when we were being trained in the art of yoga by Sandy while we were in India due to a back injury. Sandy said Swami Varunda informed Rick if he wanted to proceed any further down the path which Sir Malcolm took, he must first become a yoga master. While in India, the Swami Varunda was Rick's spiritual leader, but, on this trip, Sandy had to step in to guide him and keep him on the straight and narrow. Sandy had promised to give us all an advanced yoga session during that trip. Watching Cheesy eat his breakfast, I turned to Ian and asked him, "Do you remember Chef Philippe from Ridgeway?" To which he replied, he believed that whenever the recipe got a splash of wine, the chef should also get a splash. The nights we had coq au vin, he was sloshed to the gills, as my mother would say. Chef Philippe told Cheesy that he ate his soup like the bucket dredgers ate the Seine. And Cheesy barely looked up from his meal. Now you know Cheesy can take a joke, but you best be ready to receive one back. He made wanted posters looking for a man who was urinating in public and destroying vegetables in the marketplace. Was that all one crime or two? Ian asked and chuckled. The image he used on the poster was Chef Philippe, but he just converted it with the sketch filter of his paint program. I said. He looked more real that way, Cheesy said, and continued to slurp his soup. Then you posted him all over the marketplace where Chef Philippe bought his daily fresh ingredients. I added. I remember. Chef Philippe had to send his sous chef Maurice to the market because all of the vendors started throwing rotten vegetables at him when he passed. Ian said amid the laughter that was consuming us. And they would grab their crotch and shake it in his direction. I said as I doubled over with laughter, and Cheesy simply got up and walked into the atrium. What were they yelling at him as he passed by? Ian asked, and I replied, it was in French. I think it was, Chen qui pisse. Pissing dog. Cheesy shouted from the atrium. After breakfast we spread out our yoga mats next to where Sandy and Rick were already meditating. Cheesy whispered, it's easier to meditate when scorpions aren't crawling up your ass. After yoga we all met with Ian and Rick, who had some new information for us from India and more specifically from Nainital. Rick started out, I've been mulling over Sir Malcolm's puzzle poem which was in the box he left in his house. Do you remember? Magda broke the code of the puzzle box and revealed the poem, and he recited the poem for us in case we didn't already have it committed to memory. The hill papal is the tree with knowledge. Through the African soil on 8 legs, it scrambles. The precious nectar holds life and liberation, or death and new beginning. Kali collects the blood and Shiva demands each must drink. The earthly net will bring minds together. There were several people referenced in various documents I found in his library which may be important in this context. The first was a doctor from the southern United States whom Sir Malcolm had correspondence with on multiple occasions. Her name was Dr. Olivia Spangler, and he was introduced to her by Lord Andrew. We know Sir Malcolm accompanied the good doctor to Africa and more specifically Kenya, and even more specifically, Windhaven. I found out that Dr. Spangler was a specialist in spider venom, and in particular, the brown recluse spider Loxosceles reclusa, which produces the most potent venom among known arachnids. The brief information we found on her was that she was extracting proteins from various fluid sources in the spider. Her research facility was moved to India, at least as far as forwarding information was concerned, and then there was no further information on Dr. Spangler for the last 30 years as she seemed to retire from academic life. Before leaving she was credited with discovering that the venom of the brown recluse could cause dermonecrotic arachnidism, but I'm not sure that that's relevant here. What's that? I asked, to which Dr. Ben replied, It's an open wound on the skin that grows and eats away the skin around it. It's a pretty nasty way to go. Like alien spit, Cheesy said, and Dr. Ben responded, yes, exactly like alien spit, Cheesy. Very good, have a banana. Dr. Ben proceeded, we need to study the protein and peptide profile of the venom isolated from both the male spider and the female spider, then look at its antimicrobial activity or toxicity against human cells and hemolytic activity. We still don't know what part of the spider's arsenal is required to fit the formula, and since this spider doesn't have a species name, how will we know it's the correct spider? Its ability to cause wounds seems an unlikely requirement for this journey. Dr. Ben then noted, peptides are purified using high-performance liquid chromatography known as HPLC, and its chemical properties can be displayed using mass spectrometry. We can do those tests at Windhaven now with our new microscopes. Ian decided that was the perfect time to introduce the subject of the search of the stone pile on the land left by Sir Malcolm to Windhaven in his will. Today we should go and find the rock pile we saw from Martin's balloon. Jay and I know where it's located because we found it once before, and we can take you there now. We need Dr. Ben too, especially if venomous spiders are about. Jay and I didn't disturb it or even get close to it. We took the stroll from the house to the lab site along the usual path, and this time we saw a spitting cobra about 10 meters off the path. Ian said, just let him go about his business, he isn't interested in us. He can spit his venom about a third of the distance to where we are. Rick actually had a snake stick with him, so we felt safe, but cobra venom in the eye was not something we wanted to experience. I found in Nainital, there are places where you can run into some very impressive snakes. Actually, that fits into the story I haven't finished yet. He continued to discuss other parts of the puzzle and informed us, I've been working with the local tiger sanctuary in Nainital. There is a Swami at the sanctuary known as Swami Varunda, a disciple of Swami Samka, now deceased. Swami Samka was Sir Malcolm's guiding spirit. I'm not totally sure of the connection between Sir Malcolm and Swami Samka, but the connection with karma must have started there, because unless it's a coincidence, they have pictures on the wall that show Lord Andrew and a young Sir Malcolm with karma at the sanctuary. Sir Malcolm is also pictured with a tiger by the name of Dharma when he's a bit older. Swami Varunda is an expert on certain types of mushroom fungi by some major coincidence. To which Ian interjected, that could be the connection with the communication between Lord Andrew and karma. But that still doesn't tell us how the spider venom is involved. Cheesy noted. Or what knowledge the tree has and whose blood is being used. I added. We arrived at Windhaven Labs for a brief stop, limited to picking up a couple of 4x4s. We headed north and then west from the labs towards the Tanner River across scrub land that kicked up a huge cloud of dust as we bounced over the waves of dunes and gullies. The wildlife could see us coming from kilometers away and scattered on our approach, leaving only the scorpions and death adders to stand their ground. The pile of rocks was not visible from where we stopped, and Jay was consulting a topographical map of the area. She pointed off to the north towards the river, and both vehicles darted off in that direction. As we approached, the mound of rocks rose above the surrounding landscape, and we disembarked from the vehicles. Dr. Ben cautioned us to keep well away while he investigated the site. The rocks were piled about 4 feet off the ground and concealed a small space inside the rock pile, but we didn't know why. Perhaps Dr. Spangler had to go inside to collect her specimens. This isn't like catching a snake or a big spider like a tarantula or even a scorpion. The brown recluse can be up your leg and in your underwear before you can scratch your nuts. Dr. Ben said, and pointed at Cheesy, who was suitably warned. Jay asked, how are you going to catch it, Dr. Ben? And he replied, if this is a brown recluse, they are most active at night and can survive months without a food source, so they may not be active. Perhaps that's why there is a small entrance to a hollowed-out area below ground. However, I have a secret weapon. Cheesy, pass me my backpack. He took out a portable vacuum cleaner with a long extending hose on it. That's how you're gonna catch the little buggers. Cheesy applauded. Go for it, Ghostbuster. And Errol added, Egon. My favorite. Quote. Jay followed up with a more intelligent question, will you recognize the brown recluse, Dr. Ben? And he replied, there's only one other spider it looks like, and that's the wolf spider. You have to look them in the eyes to tell them apart. The brown has 8 and the wolf has 6. There will be no tears of mysterious tenderness in any of those eyes, Mr. Shelley. Dr. Ben approached the stone pile with his socks over his pant legs and his vacuum hose in hand. He circled around the rock pile almost completely before he stuck the nozzle into the cave entrance, which was barely more than a crevice by this point. His attention was on the clear collection chamber as well as the hose itself. I can't believe Dr. Spangler went in there looking for spiders, Dr. Ben said, to which I suggested, maybe she used a gas. Several more insertions were made and he wiggled the nozzle around inside the area in the rock pile until he was finished. Making sure there were no spiders on the outside of the hose, he strolled back to us looking into the clear container of the vacuum's dust trap. Several spiders could be seen crawling around inside the container. Well? Ian asked with bated breath. They are brown recluse, but these are not what I was expecting. Dr. Ben informed us, it's from the recluse family, but it's not a typical American brown recluse transplanted here in Africa as we were expecting. These spiders have an odd structure to them. I will have to do an autopsy on one before I jump to conclusions, but these appear to be ancient recluse spiders. We've got to get a DNA sample as well as a venom sample, then see if we can find the DNA of other recluse spiders. I'm sure I have several males and at least one female in this jar. I'll take them back to the lab and set them up. Mark the GPS location in case I need to come back for additional samples. I'll get a warning sign made up too, Ian noted. This spider was not a known species and its origin was vague to say the least. Dr. Spangler must have planted this colony here with the help of Sir Malcolm. How they have survived this long is a mystery, but then I realized that Sir Malcolm probably came to Africa for this specific reason, to ensure the spiders survived. Sir Malcolm must have harvested the venom or saliva and taken it back to Lord Andrew in India to make the concoction that allowed him to inhabit Karma's being. Why would he protect the spiders after coming to Africa? Was he planning to find a need for them again? By that time he should have been finished with them, I asked, and Ian suggested, we must read Sir Malcolm's diary to find the answer to that question. How could they survive here for so long? Dr. Ben told us, bites are uncommon, brown recluse bites turn red, cause pain and itching for a few hours and then break down the tissue. That can lead to an open sore which can take a week to really develop. By that time the person has no idea where they got the bite. Even if the doctor recognizes this as a bite from a spider that doesn't exist here, what's he going to do? These spiders bite as an act of defense and are very unlikely to harm humans unless they feel threatened. Their enemies are mosquitoes, just like us. There are probably lots of mosquitoes at certain times of year this close to the river. Look around, there's no reason for people to be here except us or perhaps poachers. Perhaps Sir Malcolm placed something in the cave that attracted dinner for them. We took our new species of spider back to the lab and Dr. Ben secured his new pets for observation and documentation. Venom, anatomy, and blood samples would eventually follow. Later that week, Cheesy and I had a meeting with Dr. Sue scheduled to learn about her current projects and what she was hoping to achieve from each that would contribute to her grand design. We arrived at her office a little bit earlier than planned, so we sat and had a coffee while listening to her working with her students. Is there a common mechanism of eukaryotic sex? Recent reports talk of an ancient protein that's the key to gamete fusion and may be a potential target for malaria vaccines. When one cell divides into two, both must have the same genetic information. Therefore, before cell division occurs, the genes must duplicate themselves so all the genetic information ends up in each. Genetic reassortment, or the mixing of genes between two organisms to make a new genetic sequence, is known as creating a recombinant. A very powerful mechanism for evolution and adaptation. Each human is a recombinant of their parents' genes. Reduction division creates the first cell division in meiosis. In that process the germ cells are formed. Remember, the chromosome number is reduced from diploid, which is 46 chromosomes, to haploid, which is only 23 chromosomes. The first meiotic division and the first meiosis. Then subsequent fusion of those two cells allows for additional vital processes to occur. Tell me what an allele is, she asked the students, and Joan replied, an allele is one of two or more versions of a gene that individuals inherit when they acquire two alleles for each gene, one from each parent. If the two alleles are the same, the individual is homozygous for that gene. If the alleles are different, the individual is heterozygous for that gene. Good, she said. Reassortment is the mixing of the genetic material of a species into new combinations in different individuals, including the assortment of chromosomes and chromosomal crossover. I knew that from a historical perspective, reassortment was responsible for some of the major genetic shifts of the influenza virus. From the Asian flu to the Hong Kong flu pandemics. Those flu strains were caused by the reassortment of an avian virus and a human virus. In addition, the H1N1 virus responsible for the swine flu pandemic was an unusual mix of swine, avian and human influenza genetic sequences. Regardless of the method, the focus is on a protein known as GCS1, or generative cell-specific 1, or HAP2. It was first identified in screens for male fertility mutants that were defective in pollen tube growth in the plants Arabidopsis and Lilium longiflorum pollen. Then again in a screen for mutants compromised at later stages of gamete interaction in the green algae Chlamydomonas reinhardtii. GCS1 has a clear role in plant and algal fertilization, but genome searches have also revealed homologs in malaria parasites like Plasmodium, African sleeping sickness parasites Trypanosoma brucei, slime molds, ciliates, choanoflagellates and cnidarians. That suggests that GCS1 is an ancient and highly conserved component of the gamete fusion apparatus. Research work with malaria parasites to investigate the GCS1 function uses Plasmodium as a model system. Typically, doing anything in the lab with malaria parasites, as you know, is very difficult. Studying malaria parasite sex is a notable exception. Gamete production in malaria parasites starts when the parasites are taken up in a mosquito blood meal. Gametogenesis can be initiated in vitro by simply taking parasites cultured in blood and altering temperature and pH to mimic conditions found in the mosquito midgut. A student asked, gametogenesis, in embryology, is the process where gametes, or germ cells, are produced in an organism. Dr. Su replied, yes, the formation of egg cells, called oogenesis, and the formation of sperm cells, or spermatozoa, known as spermatogenesis. Moreover, Plasmodium gametes lack the complex extracellular matrix that surrounds the gametes of most other organisms, providing direct access to the action. Loss of the GCS1 gene in microgametes, the male gamete in Plasmodium, reveals its requirement for successful fertilization. Deletion of GCS1 blocked zygote formation and subsequent parasite development in the mosquito host, effectively stopping the transmission of the disease. In angiosperms, a haploid male gamete, the sperm cell, fuses with a haploid female gamete egg cell during fertilization to form a zygote carrying paternally and maternally derived chromosomes. But those are plants, aren't they? Jim asked. She replied, yes, angiosperm eggs are fertilized and develop into a seed in an ovary that is usually in a flower. Immunological assays indicate that GCS1 is accumulated during late gametogenesis and is localized on the plasma membrane of generative cells. In addition, Arabidopsis thaliana GCS1 mutant gametes fail to fuse, resulting in male sterility and suggesting that GCS1 is a critical fertilization factor in angiosperms. Importantly, GCS1 is apparently exposed on the surface of the male gamete, raising the possibility of targeting this molecule as part of a transmission blocking strategy. I said to Cheesy, we were just talking about this. Remember Star Trek? And Cheesy said, yeah, I know. Receptors on proteins. The idea here is to create a good Samaritan vaccine that prevents people from passing on the infection by inducing antibodies to block development of the parasite only after it leaves the human host and enters the insect. When she finished with her students, she sat down with Cheesy and me. Cheesy commented, GCS1 sounds pretty important. Dr. Su told us, that's the tip of the iceberg. The investigation of GCS1 function goes a step further, pursuing the exact timing of GCS1 function in chlamydomonas. I think that GCS1 acts in the few seconds between gamete adhesion and fusion. That would suggest a role in the fusion process itself. A post-adhesion function was also indicated for GCS1 in Plasmodium. It's interesting to note that the molecules involved in the pre-fusion adhesion processes in chlamydomonas and Plasmodium are unrelated, suggesting that GCS the 1st may perform an essential function like membrane fusion. It appears that GCS1 has ancient origins, most likely being conserved since the divergence of all eukaryotes, and it's intriguing that GCS1 has apparently disappeared in higher animals. I'm going to have Dr. Ben check the spiders he found to see how they reproduce. Good idea, I thought. That could be the piece missing that the spider brings to the party. Recognizing the instance of creation and moment of death seemed critical to me at the time. She continued, this is somewhat at odds with its apparent role in the fundamental process of gamete fusion. The only obvious homologue among insects is in the flower beetle Tribolium castaneum. The region of homology to GCS1 is confined to the amino terminus and the carboxyl terminus of the flower beetle protein. Ian asked, what is the amino terminus and carboxyl terminus? Proteins are composed of a linear chain of amino acids linked to one another through an amide bond. Amino acids have an amine functional group at one end and a carboxylic acid functional group at the other. It's the linking of the carboxylic acid group of one amino acid with the amine group of another that produces this amide bond. This process is controlled by the protein translational machinery of the cell and results in the conversion of messenger RNA, mRNA, into a protein. End markers. This sequential linking of amine and carboxylic acids through the length of the protein chain means that, once the protein chain is completed, one end of the protein will have a free amine group and the other end will have a free carboxylic acid group. The free amine end of the chain is called the N-terminus, or amino terminus, and the free carboxylic acid end is called the C-terminus, or carboxyl terminus. The fact that these two protein termini are chemically different from one another means that they will naturally have different chemical properties. That fact can be exploited and allows the use of specific chemical procedures for sequencing proteins by way of the termini. Errol and I were looking to provide an N-terminal sequencing service known as gas phase sequencing, or Edmond degradation, a method of sequencing amino acids in a peptide. The amino terminal residue is labeled and cleaved from the peptide without disrupting the peptide bonds between other amino acid residues. N-terminal sequence analysis has a number of applications in drug development. Mass spectrometry can't be used because there's no mass difference between the two amino acids, they're isomers of one another. Cheesy asked, what are isomers? Isomers are compounds that contain exactly the same number of atoms, so they have exactly the same empirical formula, but differ from each other in the way the atoms are arranged. By manipulating the formula C8H10, the isomers can be ethylbenzene, M-xylene, P-xylene, and O-xylene. Mass spectrometry can provide useful structural information as part of an investigation of this nature by generating amino acid sequencing from chromatographically separated peptides. However, since leucine and isoleucine are isomers, they can't be categorically identified by mass. In these cases, peptides containing leucine or isoleucine can be purified and subjected to N-terminal sequencing using Edman chemistry. Leucine and isoleucine derivatives have unique chromatographic elution positions, therefore can be categorically identified. There's no fully analogous method like Edman chemistry for determining the C-terminal sequencing of a biopharmaceutical. For the C-termini, you can use carboxypeptidase digestion and mass spectrometric mapping strategies. A peptide map is a fingerprint of a protein and the end product of several processes that provide a comprehensive understanding of the protein being analyzed. Peptide mapping is considered a comparative procedure to confirm the primary structure of the protein and detects any alterations to that structure. Intact molecular weight analysis can be used as an orthogonal procedure to support conclusions regarding the structures of the N and C termini. I knew you would get around to me sooner or later, Cheesy said. In mathematics, orthogonality is the notion of perpendicularity to the linear algebra of bilinear forms. Two elements U and V of a vector space with bilinear form B are orthogonal when B equals 0. Depending on the bilinear form, the vector space may contain non-zero self-orthogonal vectors. We nodded and pretended like we knew what the hell he just said. Monoclonal antibodies are proteins where C-terminal variation can be found. The C-terminal lysine residues of the heavy chains can be removed, resulting in variability of the C-terminus heavy chains. That has similarity to a family of calcium transporters involved in neural signaling. If GCS1 is indeed an important part of the ancestral gamete fusion apparatus, that might suggest that complex, multicellular organisms have invented novel new forms of gamete fusion. Mammals retain a typical process of gamete fusion where GCS1 has been replaced with unique proteins not yet thoroughly described. Cheesy turned to me and said, I know what you're thinking. Is GCS1 the Atman? Right. I nodded. The novel adaptations in these organisms raise intriguing questions. Is evolutionary experimentation with new methods of fertilization unique to animals, or has it occurred in other kingdoms? What drove the desire to have novel adaptations in gamete fusion? We know that Darwin's critters were after some better nectar, a rather obvious reward, but who or what planned this change and why? Was it the loss of GCS1, or did other evolutionary changes make GCS1-mediated gamete fusion deleterious to a particular species? Dr. Sue let us know. Floren's been helping us gain information on phages by traveling to remote towns in Siberia where a great deal of research was developed by doctors under governments that don't exist anymore. Many of those doctors are willing to sell their research or be funded to carry on with it, but contact must be personal, so General Anupov is introducing Floren. One doctor's interest in phage solutions was based on phages that showed either growth suppression effects known as lysogeny or destruction of the target bacteria known as lysis. The phage showing lysis was amplified on cultures of the target bacteria, filtered, then distributed. There are large storage facilities with specific strains of phages and phage cocktails mapped to the bacteria they attack. These are all available and we can ship them overland to Moldavia where Floren's people can work with them. Each one has its own specific DNA. The lytic life cycle is where phages infect and rapidly kill their host cells by shaping bacterial population dynamics. That impacts their long-term evolution by way of generalized transduction, which occurs when bacterial DNA is packaged into phage heads instead of phage DNA. Generalized transduction? I asked. Phage particles that have encapsulated bacterial DNA are called transducing particles. Like any typical phage particle, they can adsorb to the surface of the host and eject their DNA into the host's cytoplasm. Cytoplasm sounds like something from a horror movie, Cheesy observed. Cytoplasm is the gelatinous liquid that fills the inside of a cell. It's composed of water, salts, and various organic molecules. Some intracellular organelles are organized structures of specific morphology and function. It's been claimed that harmless strains of Corynebacterium may have been converted into Corynebacterium diphtheriae, which probably killed a third of all Europeans coming to North America in the 17th century. Many phages seem to be lytic only, which means they disintegrate the cell membrane with negligible probability of becoming lysogenic or integrating into the chromosome of the host bacterium and replicate with it. Phages are used to fight pathogens in farm animals like Campylobacter, a bacteria that infects the intestinal tract but very rarely can also infect the bloodstream. When a person gets sick with that infection, it's called campylobacteriosis, a common cause of diarrhea worldwide. That was how Floren sped up the reaction of some of his magical tricks, I'll bet. Maybe even the gabooning of the poison voice. Escherichia is a genus of gram-negative, non-spore-forming, facultatively anaerobic, rod-shaped bacteria from the family Enterobacteriaceae. Gram-negative bacteria cause infections like pneumonia or bloodstream infections and are resistant to multiple drugs and resistant to most available antibiotics. The fact that they're non-spore-forming means they're developed internally in the animal or insect. Being facultatively anaerobic means they can create the ATP by aerobic respiration or fermentation depending on the availability of oxygen. Adenosine triphosphate is the precursor to DNA and RNA and is used as a coenzyme. Genomic analysis suggests that the ability of Schimwelia blatti to synthesize vitamin B12 had its origins in horizontal gene transfer. Horizontal gene transfer is the movement of genetic material between unicellular and multicellular organisms by methods other than DNA from parent to child. HGT is an important factor in the evolution of many organisms. I'm not quite sure we covered what we were here for, but Dr. Sue always left us with lots to think about and a little confused at what we had just learned. She thinks and talks so fast. It's clear in her head, but as Cheesy observed, can you imagine supercharging your brain like that for 16 hours a day, probably 7 days a week? She's not even on drugs, but I'll bet she's addicted. Errol, Cheesy and I took a few days to work on the Windhaven estate with Jeffrey, Kim, Dr. Ben, and Hamish installing the new poles or towers that would provide platforms for the cameras in Cheesy's new anti-poaching system. Each camera was laid out to have visuals of each tower around them in all directions, unless they were on the edge of the grid. This should give multiple viewpoints of incidents for corroboration and triangulation. For this type of grid structure, Windhaven required more than 200 such towers, taking into consideration the topographical layout of the land and the distance the cameras could service. This was a very large investment when the price of the cameras was considered, but Cheesy had help from Mary in securing matching funds from various wildlife interests not only in Africa but worldwide. With the funds Windhaven was contributing along with the celebrity donations led by the One-Eyed Jacks, there was enough money to launch this project successfully. Animals would be saved. On the installation team, I had the best role. I was the eye in the sky. Not only did I get to fly the drone and keep an eye out for any dangerous critters in the area, but I also got to do it from inside the vehicle. Even Errol would comment, "Get your ass out here, mate. There's less than 50 little buggers that can kill you here." Errol was focused on enzymes for his research project, and while we were working, he told us, the best-known role of proteins in the cell is in the role of enzymes that catalyze chemical reactions to accelerate them. They carry out most of the reactions in metabolism, as well as manipulating DNA in processes like replication, repair, and transcription. Some enzymes act on other proteins to add or remove chemical groups through post-translational modification. About 4,000 reactions are known to be catalyzed by enzymes. Seeing the look on Cheesy's face, he explained, post-translational modification refers to the covalent and enzymatic modification of proteins after protein biosynthesis. Proteins are synthesized by ribosomes translating mRNA into polypeptide chains, which then undergo post-translational modification to form the mature protein product. I recalled that Florin once told me, the rate of acceleration conferred by some enzymatic catalysis can reach 1,000 times the normal unimpacted reaction could take. Molecules bound or acted on by enzymes are substrates. Enzymes can consist of hundreds of amino acids. Only a small fraction of the residues come in contact with the substrate or are directly involved in the reaction being sped up. A substrate is loaded into the active site of the enzyme, and when the reaction has taken place, the result is created. I said, this stuff is relevant to what we're doing. Restriction enzymes are essential tools for recombinant DNA technology. A restriction enzyme, restriction endonuclease, or restrictase cleaves DNA into fragments at or near specific recognition sites within molecules or restriction sites. Dr. Ben piped in, restriction enzymes are one class of the broader endonuclease group of enzymes. The enzymes known as Cas711 can modify RNA targets without harming cells. New editing enzymes are on the horizon from the family of proteins called ISCB. ISCB genes sit near stretches of the genome coding for RNA molecules that guide the ISCB protein to specific regions of DNA that it can cleave. Similar to the guide RNA Cas9 uses to find its genetic target. These proteins are thought to be the ancestors of the enzyme Cas9, which is CRISPR's molecular scissors. During genome editing, Cas9 teams up with a snippet of RNA that guides the enzyme to find and cut a specific DNA sequence. The technique's reliance on RNA as a guidance system is a key reason for its versatility and widespread use, because it allows researchers to easily target Cas9 to the region of the genome they want to alter. The discovery of other RNA-targeted enzymes capable of cutting DNA could yield further tools for genome editing. Programmable proteins are something Patramama has created independently many times, though as I dropped off to sleep that night. Every morning after breakfast I took the opportunity to have a yoga session with Sandy, Rick, Ian and Cheesy. I think Dick was making sure Dr. Sue got back on the yoga bandwagon, so he didn't usually join us. Sandy began, a darshana is a viewing or sighting of a deity or holy person you can consider a story. The Samkhya is one of the oldest metaphysical worldviews and philosophies of salvation. It's the metaphysical side that mystifies most people. I asked, is the metaphysical concept taking a leap of faith and believing that everyone and everything has a soul and there is a supreme being? Sandy replied, in a nutshell yes, but there is more to it than that. The Samkhya describes the world with 25 principles. The Bhagavad Gita consists of 18 different yogas, such as Karma Yoga, which is the yoga of action, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, or Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. The Gita teaches that yoga is for everyone. It views yoga as a state where the mind resides only in the soul and therefore not in the senses. When I meditated with Sandy last summer, he taught me how to block out some of my senses so that I could focus on my meditation better. I've a long way to go, but it was a revelation that I needed to convince myself yoga has some benefit to me. Dick had told me earlier. Sandy continued, the Sasthi Tantra was an expansion of those principles to 60. Like the other darsanas, Samkhya has a concept of bondage and liberation. The Yoga Sutras attributed to the sage Patanjali were written in 500 BCE by combining knowledge about yoga from much older traditions. The sutras are concise, memorable, expressions of a truth or principle contained in 4 padas or from 4 standpoints. I love to look at issues from various perspectives because every perspective believes they are the right perspective. So much misunderstanding can be cleared up. The Samadhi Pada has 51 sutras on being absorbed in spirit. Samadhi is direct and reliable perception known as pramana, where the yogi's self-identity is absorbed into pure consciousness, collapsing the categories of witness, witnessing, and witnessed. Samadhi is the main technique the yogi learns to dive into the depths of the mind to achieve kaivalya or liberation. It describes yoga and the nature and means of attaining samadhi. The Sadhana Pada has 55 sutras on being immersed in your spirit. 2 systems of yoga are described in that pada, Kriya Yoga and Ashtanga Yoga, which you will hear referred to as eightfold or 8-limbed yoga. In Kriya Yoga, the practice of 3 of the niyamas of Ashtanga Yoga are included. They include tapas or austerity, svadhyaya or the self-study of scriptures, and isvara pranidhana, which is your devotion to a God or pure consciousness. So, be poor, read your Bible and praise God. Cheesy questioned and Sandy answered him with only a look. Ashtanga Yoga is the yoga of 8 limbs. The limbs each represent something different, and we will examine each of those later. The yama teaches restraint and ethics of behavior, while the niyama are observances and the asana are the physical postures. Vibhuti Pada has 56 sutras on supernatural abilities and gifts, meaning power or manifestation. Supernormal powers known as siddhi can be acquired through the practice of this yoga. Combined simultaneous practice of dhrana, dhyana and samadhi is referred to as samyama. It's considered a tool to achieve perfections. Powers can become an obstacle to the yogi seeking moksha. That sounds ominous, Cheesy observed. The last one is the Kaivalya Pada with 34 sutras on absolute freedom. Kaivalya literally translates to isolation, but in this context it means emancipation or liberation and is used where other texts employ the term moksha or liberation. The Kaivalya Pada describes the process of liberation and the reality of transcendental ego. Yamas are ethical vows. Consider these as moral imperatives. They are ahimsa, which means be non-violent and do no harm to other living beings through your actions or speech. Satya, meaning you must speak only truthfulness, including little white lies. Astya, meaning you must not steal. Brahmacharya, which is the observance of chastity, marital fidelity or sexual restraint depending on your current life situation, and aparigraha, meaning you must not be greedy, grasping, or possessive. The commentaries tell you why each will aid in the personal growth of an individual or self. Patanjali refers to the yamas as the great vow. He says the practice of the yamas is universal and should not be limited by class, place, time, or circumstance. Where were these yamas during partition? Cheesy asked. That's a difficult path to follow for most, Ian stated. Although I guess that's just an excuse. Many of these things are really not as religious as I thought, but more about what it takes to be a decent human. Sandy said, yes Ian, I agree. That's where the second step of Patanjali's yoga path we need comes into play. The niyama includes virtuous habits, behaviors, and observances. Sadhana Pada lists the 5 niyamas as shaucha, which is purity, clearness of mind, speech, and body, santosha or contentment, acceptance of others. Acceptance of your circumstances is there so that you can get past them or change them, as well as an optimism for self. Tapas, which means persistence, perseverance, and austerity. Svadhyaya, which is self-study, self-reflection, introspection of self's thoughts, speeches, and actions, and contemplation of Ishvara as God or Supreme Being, Brahman, true self, or unchanging reality. Next on Patanjali's yoga path is the asana or meditation posture that you can hold for a period of time, staying relaxed, steady, comfortable, and motionless. Asana are perfected over time by relaxation of effort with meditation on the infinite. Rick told us, it took me a while to hold the pose in meditation because I would begin to slump. I can maintain my asana now for my full meditation with ease. Sandy said, let's talk about 12 seated meditation postures that you can eventually master. There may come a time when you are following a specific yoga routine that requires that your energy flow through a specific seating posture. He sat in front of us in the first position and identified it as the familiar lotus position, and now the hero. Once we were comfortable trying to mimic him, he went on to the next one. The glorious, and we caught up, and then he continued through the lucky mark, the staff, the supported, and finally the bedstead. Now we come to the seated animals. And we followed him through the seated heron, the seated elephant, the seated camel to evenly balanced. Patanjali's pranayama describes the restraining and extending of breath as well as the stretching between asana or postures. After a desired posture has been achieved, you should move to the next limb of yoga. It also means not taking any input or any information from your sense organs, retracting the sensory experience from external objects, a step of self-extraction and abstraction. Pratyahara is the next step where you not only close your eyes to the sensory world, but you consciously close your mind's processes to the sensory world. Empower yourself to stop being controlled by the external world and focus attention on seeking self-knowledge to experience the freedom of your inner world. No wonder sage Patanjali is Mr. Yoga, cheesy quipped. Pratyahara marks the transition of the yoga experience from the first 4 limbs that perfect external forms to the last 3 limbs that perfect the inner state. The journey is from outside to inside, from outer sphere of body to inner sphere of spirit. Patanjali's next step involved dhrana, which in this context meant concentration, introspective focus, and one-pointedness of mind. It's holding your mind onto a particular inner state, subject, or topic on your mind. The mind may be fixed on a mantra, your breath, the tip of your tongue, or even a concept or idea in the mind. Fixing the mind means one-pointed focus, without drifting of mind, and without leaping from topic to topic. Jhana, the next to last limb, means contemplation or reflection and profound, abstract meditation. Jhana is contemplating, reflecting on whatever dhrana has focused on. They rock each other's pendulums, I thought. Sandy continued, if dhrana focuses on a personal deity, jhana is the contemplation of that deity. If dhrana is on an object, jhana is a non-judgmental, non-presumptuous observation of that object. If dhrana is based on a concept or idea, jhana is contemplating the concept or idea in all its aspects, forms, and consequences. Jhana is an uninterrupted train of thought, current of cognition, flow of awareness. Dhrana is a state of mind, jhana is the process of mind. We all considered that for a moment before Sandy went to the last limb. Samadhi, the last limb, means putting together, joining, combining, union, harmonious whole. A oneness with the subject of the meditation, a spiritual state when your mind is absorbed in whatever it is you're contemplating and loses the sense of its own identity. The thinker, the thought process, and the thought fuse with the subject of the thought. There is only oneness, samadhi. Samadhi, we all said at once. That ended that session for the day. I had the opportunity one day to speak with Dr. Emily and Jay in their lab about their work. I'm convinced there are clues to human evolution through the changes in DNA that a person experiences during their lives. A study just out shows that as we get older, our DNA changes. Researchers showed that over a period of 10 to 16 years, people's DNA changed as much as 20%. These differences aren't in the famous A, T, C, and Gs of DNA though. I had to wonder 20% of what. Instead, they're changes in something called DNA methylation. DNA methylation is a biological process by which methyl groups are added to the DNA molecule. Methylation can change the activity of a DNA segment without changing the sequence. She told me. When located in a gene promoter, DNA methylation typically represses gene transcription. In mammals, DNA methylation is essential for normal development and is associated with a number of key processes including genomic imprinting, X chromosome inactivation, repression of transposable elements, aging, and carcinogenesis. Genomic imprinting causes genes to be expressed or not expressed depending on whether they're inherited from the mother or the father. Genes can also be partially imprinted. Is that why someone might say baldness is inherited from your mother? I asked. Yes, broadly defined, epigenetic phenomena are propagated alternative states of gene expression, molecular function, or organization specified by the exact same DNA sequence. In embryonic development in females, one of the 2 X chromosomes is randomly and permanently inactivated in cells other than egg cells. This phenomenon is called X inactivation and ensures that females, like males, have only one functional copy of the X chromosome in each body cell. Transposable elements constitute almost half of the human genome, and transposition of elements increases genome instability and the risk of cancer. Epigenetic mechanisms repress retrotransposons and prevent transposition events. Jay added, I'm finding the study of epigenetics to be extremely interesting. It's the study of how your behavior or the environment can cause changes that affect the way your genes work. These aren't like genetic changes because epigenetic changes are reversible and don't change your DNA sequence, which is passed on to future generations. They change how your body reads a DNA sequence, so they kind of sit above the genes, perhaps determining if they're activated or not, and that's where the name comes from. I thought, Cheesy would say the DNA sequence is the data and epigenetics is the software. This software doesn't cover enough territory for Cheesy though. He'd want to change far more than can be affected here. Dr. Emily continued, nucleobases are nitrogen-containing biological compounds that form nucleosides, components of nucleotides. With all of these monomers constituting the basic building blocks of nucleic acids, they can form a longer polymer chain. The ability of nucleobases to form base pairs and to stack one upon another leads directly to long-chain helical structures like ribonucleic acid or RNA or deoxyribonucleic acid, which you call DNA. There are 5 nucleobases, and I'm sure you're familiar with adenine, A, cytosine, C, guanine, G, thymine, T, and uracil, U, which are the primary or canonical bases. 2 nucleobases have been found where natural, enzymatic DNA methylation takes place, adenine and cytosine. The modified bases are N6-methyladenine, N5-methylcytosine and N4-methylcytosine. Guanine and thymine cannot. Cytosine methylation is widespread in both eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Adenine methylation has been seen in bacterial, plant, and mammal DNA. When located in a gene promoter, DNA methylation typically acts to repress gene transcription. Methylation of cytosine to form 5-methylcytosine occurs at the same 5 position on the pyrimidine ring where the DNA-based thymines methyl group is located. The same position distinguishes thymine from the analogous RNA-based uracil, which has no methyl group. The near-universal use of thymine exclusively in DNA and uracil exclusively in RNA may have evolved as an error control mechanism to facilitate the removal of uracils generated by the spontaneous domination of cytosine. DNA methylation as well as many of its contemporary DNA methyltransfer acids have been thought to evolve from early world primitive RNA methylation activity and is supported by several lines of evidence. Her work was becoming more intriguing to me, now reaching into the DNA of individuals, but seemed to be taking an abrupt turn from vital force. Later that day I found myself waiting for Cheesy to finish up with Jeffrey and Hamish, so I rechecked my emails from Tasmania. Before Errol, Cheesy and I left Tasmania for this trip to Africa, we met as a group to discuss how best to get a sample of DNA from the Thylacinus cynocephalus, our tiger. Although we knew it was not extinct, we didn't know how many were about and whether or not we would even see them again. We needed to be extremely careful when making first contact. Uncle Artis asked, "What can we get DNA samples from? What do we need to get from the little critter?" I told them, the best tool we could have to create cloned animals would be a sample of their blood. However, failing blood, DNA can be extracted from semen, skin cells, tissue, organs, muscle, brain cells, bone, teeth, hair, saliva, mucus, perspiration, fingernails, urine, or feces, and if you come up with any one of those, I don't want to know how you got it. Errol suggested we could use our heart traps for safe trapping of the animals, but we may get lots of other animals before we get a tiger. The traps will have to be checked more than daily to release animals we don't want to include in our study. Uncle Artis volunteered. Arthur's coming up for a few weeks to help around camp. He can help out and the boys are well on top of the property layout and possible places. No worries. We can focus cameras on cages that can be monitored 24/7 and if we get anything in them, respond immediately. Travis volunteered. Okay, what do we do when we get the tiger in the cage? Tamor asked, which lead us to create a checklist of items including pictures, sexing, a blood sample and recording of any identifying marks that would help us identify the individual. Should we capture additional tigers, we continue to build our DNA database. To collect the blood sample, we decided to use a sterile scalpel to create a small nick and blood sample cards to collect the DNA, then place them in sealed bags immediately. This DNA would not be fragmented, contaminated, or decayed in any way. The animal's sample site was to be treated before being released. We debated for quite some time on whether or not to release the animal if it was a female or to use her in the processing of clones. In the end, no one wanted to take this particular tiger from the family unit regardless of whether it's the mother, father, or infant. Once we get a DNA sample, then we would need some breeding stock of numbats, the closest relative. Other relatives from the same order included quolls, dunnarts, and the Tasmanian devil. Numbats could be acquired and transported from the mainland, but the devil was favoured. Besides, there were no numbats in Tasmania, they didn't want to cross the strait. Dr. Trask was rebuilding his tiger DNA from fragmented data and filling the holes with Tasmanian devil DNA, but I thought he should be using numbat for rebuilding DNA issues. Surrogate mothers were a different issue and the devil was probably better for that purpose. Both sexes of thylacines have a pouch which points backwards compared to most other marsupials. The infant must find the pouch or we must move it to the pouch. Tamor suggested, thylacines are entirely carnivorous and reluctant to scavenge, but some were recorded captured in traps baited with meat, so Travis and I decided to purchase some kangaroo meat. And we left it in their capable hands as we travelled off to Africa. Just this morning, Errol, Cheesy and I received a text from Uncle Artis. We got one. In all caps. My first instinct was to email Magda to let her know a wish of hers just came true. She replied, I know. Ian had his staff prepare lunch in the atrium of Big House in honour of the students, which gave us an opportunity to learn a little more about each and find out what the particular area of interest was. For instance, Joan van der Plat's family arrived in South Africa more than 100 years ago in the pursuit of diamonds. Her family now owns one of the largest diamond mines in the country and some of the poshest boutiques on the Riviera. I thought I was privileged. Her specialty was pathogens. A pathogen is an infectious agent that can cause disease in its target. Consider it a germ. That infectious little microorganism can be a virus, bacterium, protozoan, prion, viroid, or fungus. Take your pick, they can all be your worst nightmare. She had a wacky delivery that I think we all appreciated with the exception of Jane, one of the other students. Small animals, like worms or insects, can also cause or transmit disease. Let's call them parasites rather than pathogens just to keep their identities straight. Errol asked, are all diseases caused by pathogens? Just to show interest, I'm sure. No, not all diseases are caused by pathogens. You can have toxins for animals, genetic disorders from your parents, and even your own immune system can kill you in the case of transplanted organs. Are some pathogens more lethal than others? Dr. Emily asked. We consider pathogenicity, or what is its disease-causing capacity or relative virulence. A pathogen can also be described in terms of its ability to produce toxins, enter tissue, colonize, hijack nutrients, and even its ability to immunosuppress the host. That seemed to perk up Errol's attention. Horizontal transmission occurs between hosts of the same species. In contrast to vertical transmission, which tends to evolve towards symbiosis after a period of high morbidity and mortality in the population by linking the pathogen's evolutionary success to the evolutionary success of the host organism. Evolutionary biology proposes that many pathogens evolve an optimal virulence at which the fitness gained by increased replication rates is balanced by trade-offs in reduced transmission, but the exact mechanisms underlying these relationships remain controversial. How can it react that fast? Transmission of pathogens occurs through different routes, including airborne, direct or indirect contact, sexual contact, through blood, breast milk, or other body fluids. And even through biting, Errol thought. Pathogenic bacteria have several ways that they can cause disease. They can either directly affect the cells of their host, produce endotoxins that damage the cells of their host, or cause a strong enough immune response that the host cells are damaged. I looked around the room and realized that Joan had sent a number of minds out for a spin. Her ideas could tie in with the devil's issues, but I could see how this might impact Drive. Emily's work as well. If a person looks askance at another person, I tend to think they have a doubtful or suspicious perspective of them, so it was with great interest I continued to notice how young Jane would look askance at certain people and not at others. I began to make a mental note. I wasn't sure if this meant anything. Should I endeavor to understand why? My biggest fear was being caught looking askance at Jane while she's looking askance at me. Jane came to the team with two specialties, one being a hobby, the other her academic focus. She was from London and didn't reveal much more about her personal life other than a great uncle on her mother's side offered to send her to school in Nairobi. Fungi were her hobby, and she told us, fungi are eukaryotic organisms which can also function as pathogens. There are approximately 300 known fungi that are pathogenic to humans, including Candida albicans, which is the most common cause of thrush, and Cryptococcus neoformans, which can cause a severe form of meningitis. Her academic studies were focused on prions, which she told us are misfolded proteins. They're transmissible and can influence abnormal folding of normal proteins in the brain. They don't contain any DNA or RNA and can't replicate other than to convert already existing normal proteins to the misfolded state. The abnormally folded proteins are found characteristically in many neurodegenerative diseases as they aggregate the central nervous system and create plaque that damages the tissue structure, essentially creating holes in the tissue. Errol told me later that Cheesy whispered in his ear, brain butter, at that moment. Jim Kenyatta, or more formally James Jomo Kenyatta, was the great-great-grandson of Jomo Kenyatta and a cousin to Dr. Emily. His focus was on phages, including the T7 phage, which can be used in phage display to clone RNA binding proteins, and the lambda strains, which grow and enter the lytic cycle after superinfecting an already lysogenized cell. There are bacteriophages that infect every kind of bacteria with or without a membrane, which includes both gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria. Errol said, even pathogenic bacteria that infect other species like humans can be infected with a phage. That could make them just a shuttle from the terminal to the target. Malaria is caused by the Plasmodium parasite. The parasite can be spread to humans through the bites of infected mosquitoes. What if it carried the cure with it in the form of a phage? Dr. Sue let us know. There are many different types of Plasmodium parasites, but only 5 cause malaria in humans. She pointed to Joan, who volunteered. These include Plasmodium falciparum, which is found in Africa and is the most common type of malaria parasite responsible for the most malaria deaths worldwide. Then there is the Plasmodium vivax, which we don't need to worry about here because it's mainly found in Asia and South America. That particular parasite is interesting because although it has milder symptoms than Plasmodium falciparum, it can stay in the liver for up to 3 years before being called on for encores. You can also find Plasmodium ovale in West Africa, where it is fairly uncommon but is extremely dangerous because it can remain in your liver for several years as well without producing any symptoms, while Plasmodium malariae, even more rare, can only be found in Africa. The rareness of the species results in less knowledge or data, and that in turn makes it more difficult to fight. Even rarer is Plasmodium knowlesi, found in parts of Southeast Asia but not locally. I hope what we find here will work for all species. In you, the parasites would grow and multiply first in your liver cells and then in the red cells of your blood. In the blood, successive broods of parasites grow inside the red cells and destroy them, releasing daughter parasites known as merozoites that continue the cycle by invading other red cells. The blood stage parasites are those that cause the symptoms of malaria. When some forms of blood stage parasites are ingested during blood feeding by a female Anopheles mosquito, they mate in the gut of the mosquito and begin a cycle of growth and multiplication from within. After 10 to 18 days, a form of the parasite called a sporozoa T migrates to the mosquito's salivary glands. This part was coming back to me from our time spent with Dr. Sue last year. When the Anopheles mosquito takes a blood meal from you, an anticoagulant saliva is injected together with the sporozoites, which migrate to your liver, beginning a new cycle. But why only the Anopheles? I asked, and Dr. Sue pointed to Jane, who answered, like all mosquitoes, adult Anopheles have slender bodies with 3 sections, head, thorax, and abdomen. The head is specialized for acquiring sensory information and feeding with a pair of long, many-segmented antennae. Antennae are important when detecting host odors as well as odors of aquatic larval habitats where females lay eggs. But there is nothing really special there. The head has an elongate, forward-projecting proboscis used for feeding, and 2 sensory palps which are key. Your blood taken in through the proboscis is digested over time, serving as a source of protein for the production of the mosquito's eggs, which gradually fill the abdomen. Anopheles mosquitoes can be distinguished from other mosquitoes by their palps, which are as long as their proboscis and the discrete blocks of black and white scales on the wings. Many people have learned to recognize dangerous mosquitoes by their wing patterns. Adult Anopheles rest with their abdomens sticking up in the air rather than parallel to the surface they are resting on. The mother mosquito must acquire a blood meal each time she wants to create eggs, and that brings her back to us with or without her pathogen. Plasmodium requires a long-lived species which prefers human blood to support its development. The primary malaria vectors in Africa are Anopheles gambii and Anopheles funestus, both strongly anthropophilic and the most efficient malaria vectors in the world. Once ingested by a mosquito, malaria parasites must undergo development within the mosquito before becoming infectious to humans. The time required for development within the mosquito is 9 days or longer, depending on the parasite species and temperature. Any control measure that reduced the average lifespan of the species would reduce transmission potential. Insecticides thus need not kill the mosquitoes outright, but may be effective by limiting their lifespan. Some strains of Anopheles gambii are refractory to infection by malaria parasites. These refractory strains have an immune response that encapsulates and kills the parasites after it invades the mosquito's stomach wall. The genetic mechanism for that response is currently unknown, she concluded, and received a nod from Dr. Su. That's about as good as it gets from Dr. Su. Mosquitoes refractory to malaria could replace wild mosquitoes, eliminating malaria transmission. What would happen to Plasmodium then? At that point, Cheesy wanted to give them his genome shotgun speech but decided against it. I've heard him give it so many times I could recite it from memory. The most efficient method to determine the genomic sequence of a dsDNA phage is to use the whole genome shotgun approach. In genetics, the shotgun method is used to sequence random DNA strands. The chain termination method of DNA sequencing, known as Sanger sequencing, can only be used for short DNA strands of 100 to 1,000 base pairs. Longer sequences are subdivided into smaller fragments that can be sequenced separately, and then those sequences are assembled for the overall sequence. In shotgun sequencing, DNA is broken up randomly into numerous small segments, which are sequenced using the chain termination method to obtain reads. Multiple overlapping reads for the target DNA are obtained by performing additional rounds of fragmentation and sequencing. Cheesy has created computer AI that uses the overlapping ends of different reads to assemble them into a continuous sequence. It's truly elegant and a thing of beauty from a DNA perspective and software perspective. We didn't know why the Jacks had to cancel, but Ian learned that the Jacks were home at Castle Sel-Tradit, so we decided to make one of our fires a conference call with Florin and the Jacks. Uncle Sandu was supposedly in Prague. Cheesy set up a white sheet and a projection unit that Jeffrey and Hamish operated as hosts for session. When we connected with Moldavia, we were happy to see Uncle Sandu was there, as well as Florin, Marius, and Marian. The new doctor, Dr. Roz, was also in attendance along with Alexei. Uncle Sandu was home on a book-buying trip, and the Jacks were working on a new act with Florin. The bugs were almost worked out, so Marian told us they would be heading back to the Salton Sea in a couple days. You won't believe it when you see it next. Construction is going on everywhere on both sides of the sea. The berm is up and the canals will soon be connected to the Laguna Salada. That's when the Salton Sea comes back to life. You have to be there for that. Marius told us. Ian said to Florin, I understand you've been making some great progress with the Tesla family and his archives. Florin replied, scientists believe the universe is made up of 3 things: normal matter, and dark energy. The authorities consider these written in stone and will until they are proven wrong. Tesla said, let the future tell the truth, and evaluate each one according to his work and accomplishments. The present is theirs. The future, for which I have really worked, is mine. I think that puts us in the enviable position of eventually making that statement come to fruition. To that end, the Tesla family have created a business structure to tie their interests together under the corporate name Nikola Tesla's Family plc, NTF. Carl is consulting with them on patent law and helping them secure ownership of various patents throughout the world before any new ones are registered jointly with the Pendulum Group. Dr. Roz found some extremely interesting documents that we're continuing to explore and research. How the American doctor could determine there was nothing of value here in 3 days still boggles my mind. Politicians and military, and he and Dr. Roz laughed. I'm particularly interested in his idea that the secrets of the universe were tied to energy, frequency and vibration. Dr. Roz told us. Tesla outlined his dynamic theory of gravity, indicating luminiferous ether fills all space. The ether is acted on by the life-giving creative force and is thrown into infinitesimal whirls, or micro-helices at near the speed of light, becoming ponderable matter. When the force subsides and motion ceases, matter reverts to the ether, a form of atomic decay. Florin told us, Tesla also said, there is no energy in matter other than that received from the environment. That, of course, went against Einstein's E=mc2 theory. Dr. Roz added, humans can harness these processes to precipitate matter from the ether. Create whatever he wants with the matter and energy derived, even originate and develop life in infinite forms. Can you imagine? All matter in the universe in any phase of its existence, from its very formation to its ultimate disintegration. Florin continued. Another Tesla quote was, I have worked out a dynamic theory of gravity in all details and hope to give this to the world very soon. It explains the causes of this force and the motions of heavenly bodies under its influence so satisfactorily that it will put an end to idle speculations and false conceptions. As that of curved space, it's a great pity that Tesla never published his dynamic theory of gravity. But did he document it? Did he save any research on it, Florin? Ian asked. That's a difficult question, Ian. He has left an abundance of information and documentation, and I will volunteer this. We will be filing patents this year. That sent a gasp through the African crowd, and a buzz went around the fire. What could they have? Dr. Ross added, modern thinking about gravity suggests that when a heavy object moves it emits gravitational waves that radiate at the speed of light. These gravity waves behave in similar ways to many other types of waves. Tesla's greatest inventions were all based on the study of waves. He always considered sound, light, heat, X-rays, and radio waves to be related phenomena that could be studied using the same sort of mathematics. Mathematics is the key. If we don't understand something today, it's only because we don't understand the mathematics of the thing. There's so much information here covering different fields that we could use 100 scientists to understand this one man's mind. For instance, according to the concept of vitalism or vital force theory, he says organic matter is endowed with a vital force. I know you have people working along this line, but we don't have anyone here with that focus. Ian said, I'll speak with Dr. Emily and arrange a video conference with you, Florin. Perhaps we can get you together. We talked a while longer with Uncle Sandu telling us he was heading off on his book buying tour, and then we finally said our good nights. Leaning back in our chairs, we looked up at the African sky. Dick told us he was now a major, which immediately had Cheesy congratulating Major Dickwad. I told you years ago I would call you that someday for real. And they both laughed. Dick told us he had to leave the next day. He had been called back a week early and had to leave without being able to give us any further details. Even Dr. Sue was on a need-to-know basis. Eventually it was just Errol, Dr. Ben and I sitting by the fire while Cheesy burned the midnight oil with Jeffrey and Hamish in the lab. Predictably we talked of science, but Errol and Dr. Ben had an ongoing scenario involving the devils and their immune signaling system and how they were going to use that to save them. How does the DNA damage response unit know where to go and how to fight them when they get there? Errol asked. I heard Dr. Ben begin to respond. The activation of immune signaling is triggered by several components of the DNA damage response system. For example, the DNA damage sensors, transducer kinases, and even effectors. But I think that's about where I fell asleep. It was an hour later when Cheesy woke me for the walk back to the big house. The next day our breakfast was interrupted by an emergency that found us leaving our breakfast to run over to the labs. Apparently, Dr. Sue and Hamish were packing up a vehicle outside of the wall when a black mamba came between them and the vehicle. Dr. Sue was the closest, so the snake moved towards her and rose up. This scared her, but she did the right thing by freezing in her tracks. Jeffrey told us, Hamish moved to intercept the snake, but as he was pinning the head, it caught him with one fang. He was able to remove the snake to a safe distance and release it before coming back to Dr. Sue for treatment. Dr. Ben had heard the commotion and came out with the first aid kit. They were able to put a compression bandage on his arm and give him 2 vials of generic antivenom. It was still necessary to get him to the hospital in Nairobi because he could have required many more vials of antivenom if the bite was serious. Perhaps a completely different antivenom was required. Let's hope it was a dry bite, Ian said as we watched the car head for the main road with Hamish in the passenger seat and Jeffrey driving. Dr. Ben went along with them. He continued, for most in this country treatment is far too costly and hard to come by. Even then it's probably going to be inadequate. They may be within a few kilometers of a private clinic, but that's going to be too expensive or won't have any antivenom. That just means that they will have to travel a further 50 kilometers to find a hospital. While they're traveling, the patient is probably sweating and become incontinent and vomiting. The eyes will go dull like a movie zombie. Sometimes even the small local hospitals don't have the antivenom and the patient has to go to a bigger city. I asked him, why wouldn't the hospital have antivenom for a snake that could be in the hospital garden? A collapse in the antivenom market happened across all sub-Saharan Africa and only 2% of the needed being met. I'm sure it's not the poorest 2%. If they bite the rich or the most powerful people in the government, then the attention would be different. But it's the poorest of the poor who are tilling their fields, traveling for water or harvesting their crops. Need for antivenom is very high not only for snakes but for scorpions, spiders, and a host of other dangers. Production rates have actually fallen in recent decades, so a lot of the antivenom is actually coming from India and is absolutely useless in Africa. The World Health Assembly has increased funding and the government has increased investment in research, so I'm going to create Windhaven Antivenom plc to support the Windhaven Clinic where we can provide medical care to the locals and deliver a solution to this particular problem. Many of the victims are children. Dr. Ben is setting up a team to extract the venom and will have a team to refine it and eventually make the antivenom right here. The majority of incidents involve puff adders, black and green members, and spitting cobras. If this wasn't here, what would the parent need to do? I asked. Traditional healers would cut the patient with a razor blade and put some herbs in the wound. But if the child's father has the resources, the cost may be 100,000 Kenyan shillings. Ian told me. How can they afford to do it? I asked and he said, there are some trusts who will donate the antivenom free of charge. We will work with them to cover the complete amount since we can reduce the cost of the antivenom. I finally feel like my reason for coming to Africa was beginning to make sense to me. It also gave me a good feeling about the work the Pendulum Group was doing. The rest of the day was reduced to a snail's pace as we awaited word about Hamish and rehashing how it happened with everyone we met that day. I could see how Ian's decisions could make a huge impact on the lives of so many people around him. Today, Windhaven, tomorrow, the rest of Africa. Once Hamish arrived home safe, we decided to make it an early night. I was finishing up my yoga meditation the next morning when Cheesy came to get me. Ian arranged for a video conference with Florin and Dr. Emily and suggested Cheesy, Jay and I be available for it. We had to get over to Windhaven where Jeffrey and Hamish had set things up in the new video conference building Kim erected in the centre of the compound. It was built to host the ever-growing computer network Cheesy was laying out for Jeffrey and Hamish to run. I learned from Carl that Salton Sea dividends were already beginning to flood into the Windhaven plc trust account even though there was no water flooding into the Salton Sea yet from the ocean. At Castle Cell Traded Florin and Dr. Ross were joined by several members of the Nikola Tesla's family plc corporate structure. Florin began by saying, I would like the family members to introduce themselves to you and tell you their story beginning with Vesna Mandic. Hello. My name is Vesna Mandic as Florin has already told you. My great-aunt was Georgina Duca Mandic, Nikola's mother. Our family was one of the oldest in the area and we were already renowned as inventors before Nikola was even born. Georgina was an inventor of tools and devices that she required for her own purposes, but Nikola believed if his mother had been free to pursue her mind, she would have been able to change the world. When young Tesla fell into gambling, she told him, Go, Nikola, have fun. The sooner you lose everything we have, the better. I know you'll get over it then. Quote. She passed away more than 100 years ago at the age of 71. We hope some of her vital force exists in all of us today. And she opened her arms around the other members of the family that were gathered there. Perhaps she needed us to help her vision become a reality. Vesna sat down and the next Tesla member stood up. My name is Mirosław Trebojevic and I am a great-grandson of Angelina, a sister to Nikola. In our family we always heard stories of the great man whenever more than 3 of our family gathered. When hundreds gathered, it was a festival of Tesla stories and the things he could have invented if he had come home. He was a tall man for those days reaching almost 1.9 meters, but that also made him appear skeletal thin. Nevertheless, he was an elegant and stylish figure with meticulous grooming and clothing that I have seen in dozens of family pictures. Our family has stories of his spectacular penetrating eyes and abnormally big hands with especially huge thumbs. But those things are all superficial and not why we're here today. It was his brain and eidetic memory that brings us here today. Nikola visualized an invention in his mind with extreme precision in multiple dimensions. Then and only then would he move to the construction stage. He called this technique picture thinking. How great the world would be if we could capture the images from someone's memory. I thought. And at that moment I saw Ian write something down that I knew I had to ask him about later. Mirosław continued, he typically didn't make drawings by hand but worked from memory. Beginning in his childhood, Tesla had frequent flashbacks to events that had happened previously in his life and many of the blinding flashes of light were accompanied by visions. He said, visions are linked to words or ideas we might have come across but failed to understand. Mirosław sat down and the next Tesla family member stood. My name is Svetlana Glumachich and my great-great-grandmother was Milka Tesla, another of Nikola's sisters. My ancestor is known as Nikola's social secretary. She tried everything in her power to make him fit into society where she felt a genius such as him should mingle with the other great thinkers of the world. Nikola corresponded with Milka and tried to appease her many social thrusts as best he could. Whenever he met someone whom he knew she would be impressed by, he would casually drop her a note. One such note indicated that he had met the Hindu Swami Vivekananda. Nikola indicated in that note that they spoke of the mathematics of the relationship between matter and energy and he believed that Swami Vivekananda could link it to Vedantic cosmology. There are many such letters in our archives that put a personal face on Nikola Tesla and show what he really wanted for the world. The last of the group stood up and addressed our group. My ancestor was Marika Tesla, who later became Marcia Kosanovich, my great-great-grandmother. My name is Radmila Slavica Kosanovich. Almost 100 years ago Tesla commented on the ills of the social subservience of women and the struggle of women toward gender equality. I would like to see a future where Tesla's ideals such as that are realized in a new society that stretches around the entire Earth. Then she took her seat. Again, I saw Ian write something down and I made a mental note to find out what he was thinking. After the introductions were over, Florin started with, I want to go off on a bit of a tangent and give you some additional insight into Tesla, the man. He picked up a sheet of paper and read from it. Kipling may have been quoted as having written, East is east and west is west and never the twain shall meet, but he was not referring to the case of Nikola Tesla and Mark Twain who were in fact respected friends who did meet more than 125 years ago. He clearly thought he had said something clever and took a brief pause for a laugh that only Cheesy gave him. Then he continued, Tesla kept 4 original documents of their correspondence, but in Twain's legacy no letters from Nikola Tesla were ever found. His meticulousness and diligence dictate that he must have replied to Twain's letters and messages. One of the more famous letters from Twain to Tesla states, Dear Mr. Tesla, have you Austrian and English patents on that destructive terror which you have been inventing? And if so, won't you set a price upon them and concession me to sell them? I know cabinet ministers of both countries and of Germany, too, likewise, William II. I shall be in Europe a year, yet. Here in the hotel the other night when some interested man discussing means to persuade the nations to join with the Tsar and disarm. I advised them to seek something surer than disarmament by perishable paper or contract, invite the great inventors to contrive something against which fleets and armies would be helpless, and thus make war thenceforth impossible. I did not suspect that you were already attending to that and getting ready to introduce into the earth permanent peace and disarmament in a practical and mandatory way. I know you are a very busy man, but will you steal time to drop me a line? Sincerely yours, Mark Twain. Those who met him in his South Fifth Avenue laboratory were frequently invited to witness the demonstration of the rotating magnetic field and the production of electrical vibrations of an intensity never before achieved. Lighting like flashes of electrical fire 15 feet were an everyday occurrence, and his tubes of electric light simply amazed visitors. Well, we found his response to Mr. Twain, and he stopped to take a sip from his cup before continuing. I noticed the look on Ian's face like he already knew what was coming, but if he did, he'd been sitting on it for some time. Dear Samuel, I have shown you many wonders that I would not show every man. You have imagination and can see with your mind's eye those things others cannot. Does that not convince you that to commission such a power to any one perspective or line of thought may provide him the opportunity to preclude all others? Surely until there is a time when all man may benefit from the destructive terror you describe, then you must agree that allowing any combination of the select few to possess this knowledge would only distill the world's issues and problems down to their perspective. Your trip to Europe may enlighten you concerning the stability of this world and the nature of man. It has convinced me that even you are not ready for the destructive terror if you cannot see the harvest of nature's beauty. Nikola Tesla. Florin continued, what did Twain mean by the destructive terror, to end all wars? Well, Tesla was working on Teleforce at the time, which was a proposed defensive weapon which could accelerate pellets or slugs of material to a high velocity inside a vacuum chamber by way of an electrostatic repulsion and then fire them out of an aimed nozzle at the target. He conceived it after studying the Van de Graaff generator according to his notes. The death ray or death beam was a theoretical particle beam or electromagnetic weapon which could also be the focus of Samuel's attention. Tesla had many more options for the use of electromagnetic energy which would eventually be seen. He theorized from his experiments that if he injected electric current into the Earth at just the right frequency, he could harness what he believed was the planet's own electrical charge and cause it to resonate at a frequency that would be amplified in standing waves to be tapped anywhere on the planet to run devices or, through modulation, to carry a signal. The design used a concept of a charged conductive upper layer in the atmosphere. Tesla not only believed that he could use this layer as his return path in his electrical conduction system, but that the power flowing through it would make it glow, providing nighttime lighting for cities and shipping lanes. In short, there are a number of Mr. Tesla's patents that we will be implementing, beginning with some smaller items first and then working up to some potential life-changing discoveries. Those still need some additional work and consideration. That was where Dr. Ross was needed as the expert in this branch of physics, which involved electromagnetic force, a physical interaction occurring between electrically charged particles. The electromagnetic force carried by electromagnetic fields that are made up of electric fields and magnetic fields is responsible for electromagnetic radiation such as light. It's one of the four fundamental interactions or forces in nature. I knew the others as strong interaction, weak interaction, and gravitation. At high energy, the weak force and electromagnetic force are unified as a single electroweak force. Lightning is an electrostatic discharge traveling between two charged regions and transporting ingai, as we know. Electromagnetic phenomena are defined in terms of the electromagnetic force, or Lorentz force, which includes both electricity and magnetism as different manifestations of the same phenomenon. The electromagnetic force plays a major role in determining the internal properties of most objects encountered in daily life. The electromagnetic attraction between atomic nuclei and their orbital electrons holds atoms together. It's responsible for the chemical bonds between atoms that create molecules and intermolecular forces while governing all chemical processes, from interactions between the electrons of neighboring atoms. There are numerous mathematical descriptions of the electromagnetic field. Most prominently, Maxwell's equations, which describe how electric and magnetic fields are generated and altered by each other and by charges and currents. The theoretical implications of electromagnetism led to the development of special relativity by Albert Einstein. As Cheesy would say if you have to add, special, is it really special? Electromagnetic waves were seen as taking the form of quantized, self-propagating oscillatory electromagnetic field disturbances called photons. Different frequencies of oscillation would give rise to the different forms of electromagnetic radiation, from radio waves at the lowest frequencies, to visible light in the middle, and gamma rays at the highest frequencies. All other forces that can push our pendulums, such as friction, or contact forces, are all derived from the fundamental four forces. We said our goodbyes and ended the meeting on a rather technical note, but both rooms were full of great expectations and jocularity. After the meeting I approached Ian about the two things he had written down during the meeting. Oh, let me see what I wrote down, and he looked down at this paper. When they talked about the flashes of light he had before premonitions, it made me think that perhaps the cell-traded ladies should conduct some interviews with the DNA offspring of Georgina Ducomandic. The thought of harvesting one's thoughts and memories is more intriguing when the host is broadcasting world-changing content. That made sense to me, since the girls seemed to have a metaphysical connection with these types of things that no one else had. We spend all our time investigating the science of everything, yet there are still things in this world whose reality is based on a feeling. And your second note? I asked and he replied, possibly driven by the fact that he believed his mother could have achieved so much more. Tesla said humanity's future would be run by queen bees, as women would become the dominant sex in the future. As a general statement of equality, of course, he's right. But if his prediction of queen bees is more Nostradamus and Kali than Susan B. Anthony and Coretta Scott King, then we may be seeing our first one. He left me to contemplate that. We were still working on the infrastructure changes Kim and Jeffrey need. During our construction time on Cheesy's grid, as Jeffrey dubbed it, the topic of Gondwanan spiders and toxin came up, so Dr. Ben enlightened us on spiders in general as we worked. The spiders we found were adult brown recluse spiders, which should not be in this part of the world, so some of the assumptions we make about this genus may not be true. In addition, this particular species is not known to science at this point in time. I'm still considering its anatomy and where it fits, so let's wait a bit on that. These spiders still have the primitive pattern of 4 abdominal breathing organs known as book lungs. They generally live about 1 to 2 years, with each female producing several egg sacs over a period of 2 to 3 months. That's usually from May to July in the northern hemisphere, with approximately 50 eggs in each sac. That may or may not change based on our specific species. The eggs hatch in about 1 month and little spiderlings take about a year to grow to adulthood. It's usually a resilient spider that can tolerate up to 6 months of extreme drought and scarcity or even absence of food. A brown recluse was documented to survive in controlled captivity for more than 5 seasons without any food at all. That made me wonder if Dr. Spangler had genetically altered her little 8-legged beasts. Cheesy liked to wait at the bottom of his pole before climbing it to make final adjustments to the instruments. When he saw Dr. Ben get to his pole and throw his strap around, Cheesy was up his in a flash and generally backed down before Dr. Ben reached the top of his. Dr. Ben would usually give him the single finger salute and continue on at his own pace. This nest has not spread because the brown recluse species are not ballooners. They don't sail off on their webs to find new homes or faraway lands. They will, however, cannibalize each other if food becomes scarce. Or when an unreceptive female encounters an aggressive male, and Cheesy added, better not be Krista the spider or that's one male spider getting an ass whippin'. Strong evidence shows the genera Loxosceles and Sicarius are very old, probably originating from a common ancestor from western Gondwana, before the separation of the African and South American continents. Loxosceles venom has many toxins, but the most important for necrotic arachnidism is the enzyme sphingomyelinase D. It's present in all recluse species to varying degrees. That toxin is present in only one other known spider, which goes by the genus Sicarius. The toxin dissolves the structural components of the cell membrane, generating ring forms that act as triggers for cellular self-destruction. The area of destruction is limited to the presence of the enzyme, which can't reproduce. Spiders don't have ears, but vibration-sensing hairs tuned to tones at frequencies of 150, 400, and 750 Hz, all of which are similar to sounds of wing beats from moths, flies, and mosquitoes. This could be used for communication through the mycelium between Lord Andrew and Karma. Cheesy and Jeffrey planned a trip for us to an area to the north and west of Windhaven, almost 300 kilometers away through very rugged terrain. It was all prime poaching territory for rhinoceros, elephant, and other rare species. Very low human population in the area offered opportunities for poachers to blend into the background. On that trip, Kim was meeting with local estate owners and park rangers to see if they would like to benefit from his anti-poaching assistance and act as responders should they receive any poaching tips. I may also find some rangers for Windhaven, he told us. On that trip we also had Errol, Dr. Ben, and Dr. Sue. Hamish and Angus were along to watch our backs with the native wildlife, and Wham came along to help her dad. I asked her what she would like to add to her catalogue on this trip, and she told me, I was hoping for Evercha calicivora, a species of jumping spider from the family Solticidae, but that's when I thought we were going to Lake Victoria. It feeds primarily on female mosquitoes, and I thought Dr. Ben and Dr. Sue would like to be able to identify it. We crossed the Tanner River just 60 or so kilometers from Windhaven, and the dense vegetation that covered the river was no more than 30 yards on either side before giving way to the dry scrub again. Errol noted, the vegetation is less than a couple of kangaroo leaps from the water, mate. His Aussie speak always made Hamish and Angus laugh like giddy anime schoolgirls. We crossed several dried riverbeds and camped near another on our first night. Once the camp was struck and the fire lit, we travelled each way for a distance to see what was about. Fortunately, we didn't find what Hamish and Angus were looking for, evidence of poachers. Each time we crossed a road, they would examine the area in each direction for signs of traffic that had moved through the area and whether or not heavy vehicles passed that way. These lightly used rural roads were well known to the poachers. In the dry season, they could support the heavy vehicles needed to carry their supplies in and out quickly. Kim noted, a few cameras near these areas could do a lot to reveal poacher movement either in a pursuit situation or simply to reveal an influx of traffic into the area. We eventually crossed the C81 road, considered a highway there, and that route led north to Madogashi and south, where it connected with the A3 on the way back to larger towns on the coast. Madogashi had an unpaved airstrip, so it was of particular interest to Kim. We crossed C89, and I asked Dr. Ben where C89 led, and he said, if one were wishing to travel to Habaswein, one might travel the C89, and smirked at his rhyme. Large patches of red earth would cover the ground all around us 1 minute, then the next time I noticed, it was back to yellow. I was told ochre was any iron-rich rock that could be used as a pigment. Hematite was red ochre, chemically known as iron 3 oxide, but Jeffrey and Kim pointed out yellow ochre, goethite, hematite, and we even learned of specularite. We passed through little-known areas such as Taba, Alben and Dambas where daily water supplies could be kilometers away depending on conditions of the day. Upon our return we took a slightly different path to look for evidence of poachers by an alternate route. That route took us near Buttelu, an area that was equally forgot by whoever created this place. Kim told us, a national wildlife census carried out last year by the Kenyan Wildlife Service showed that the country's total rhino population increased from 1,258 to 1,739 rhinos. The southern white and the eastern black represent the bulk of the population with very few northern white rhinos. In fact, only 2. The whites are less aggressive than the blacks but larger. A black will charge you just to keep you on your toes. Nasty fellas. Rhinos need access to good water, nutritious vegetation, and sometimes that means translocating rhinos into an area and establishing a new population. Other times, it means removing dividing fences, allowing rhinos to roam freely across a larger area. The best way to monitor black rhinos on the ground is recording their individual ID. Kenya uses an ear notching system that provides unique numbers for its black rhinos. The Association of Private Land Sanctuaries is working to create a level playing field when it comes to rhino breeding, anti-poaching, and veterinary care for rhinos across Laikipia. The association has provided additional financial resources to each of the conservancies. Laikipia County is one of 47 counties of Kenya and truly the rhino capital of Kenya. The Laikipia country is on the other side of Mount Kenya from Windhaven, which makes Windhaven an important safe zone for rhinos on the move. WAM made sure we knew that there were rhinos in other parts of the world that may be the actual target of the Chinese businesswoman putting out the big bounty. One Sunday near the end of our trip to Africa, I found myself invited to tea with Errol, Ian, and Dr. Ben presented by the grad students Joan and Jane. Apparently, Jim went home to Nairobi for the weekend so was unable to join us, but Dr. Emily volunteered to take his place. Since Errol and Jane had the same interests, the conversation naturally went their way. It did, however, lead in an interesting way to his favorite topic, the devils. They spoke of lectins to begin the conversation. Sugar-binding proteins to the rest of us, highly specific for their sugar moieties. I did know from Errol that lectins typically played a role in biological recognition phenomena involving cells and proteins. Receptors and hormones were highly specific binding proteins. Then the conversation turned to the different types of proteins, and by this time both Dr. Ben and Joan were deeply engaged in the conversation. I was amongst those people Magda called science nerds, and loving it. Dr. Ben threw his penny into the ring with transmembrane proteins serve as ligand transport proteins to alter the permeability of the cell membranes, allowing small molecules and ions to pass. With a hydrophobic core to pass polar or charged molecules through, such molecules may enter and exit the cell. Some ion channel proteins are specialized to select only a particular ion, like potassium and sodium channels often discriminate for only one of the 2 ions. That could help your devils recognize they were under attack. Joan, not wanting to be ignored, contributed, structural proteins provide stiffness and rigidity to otherwise fluid biological components. Collagen and elastin are critical components of connective tissue like cartilage, and keratin is found in hard or filamentous structures like hair, nails, feathers, hooves, and some shells. I had to add, some globular proteins can also play structural functions, like actin and tubulin are globular and soluble as monomers, but polymerize to form long, stiff fibers that make up the cytoskeleton and allow cells to maintain their shape and size. I felt like I was sitting in on a lecture back at Oxford, so I changed the topic. A key question in molecular biology is how does a change in amino acid sequences lead to new structures and functions? Quote, Dr. Ben chimed in first with, cell signaling is important for cell regulation and for cells to process information from the environment and respond accordingly. Signaling can occur through direct cell contact or endocrine, paracrine, or autocrine signaling. Joan and Jane jumped in to demonstrate their knowledge and took turns with, direct cell-cell contact happens when a receptor on a cell binds to a molecule that is attached to the membrane of another cell. Whereas endocrine signaling occurs through molecules secreted into the bloodstream and paracrine signaling uses molecules diffusing between 2 cells to communicate. Autocrine is when a cell sends a signal to itself by secreting a molecule that binds to a receptor on its surface. Errol looked at Dr. Ben, then asked, could this be programmed into the future devils to signal their immune system to be looking out for an attacker? To which Dr. Ben replied, if we find the right part of the genome and can determine how to change it, then yes. But that won't be today. Too often I heard Dr. Benby use that phrase. I guess that was why we could never talk anything but science. Communication can be achieved through ion channels. Different types like voltage or ligand-gated ion channels were of great interest. They allow for the outflow and inflow of molecules and ions. Could voltage be the key to vital force? That night at the bonfire I asked Ian, so what happened to Sir Malcolm's vehicle? You said there was a story behind it. Yes, well, the vehicle was sold to an African prince from a country on the west coast of Central Africa by the name of Prince Broken Tusk. Jeffrey offered to deliver it to him, but there was no way I was going to let Jeffrey and Hamish drive that car across Uganda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo as well as the Republic of the Congo and Gabon. Can you image them making it through that territory with that car? I said he had to pick it up at Windhaven, so he stopped by with his entourage to pick it up. I was doing a small surgery in the clinic one day when a big black limo pulled into the parking lot and out stepped Prince Broken Tusk in all his glory, escorted by his younger brother along with their assorted bodyguards. They stood in the parking area and waited for someone to jump forth and service them. When I finished with my patient I washed up and went out to offer them our hospitality, but Prince Broken just wanted to get in his car and parade off home. The younger brother accepted my invitation and decided to stay the night before returning home. He told me later that he wanted to give his brother a head start because he figured he'd run into him in some kind of trouble along the way. I was told by the younger brother, who actually turned out to be a very intelligent fellow, that his father, King Jumbo Tusk, was a trillionaire thanks to the biggest offshore oil find in history and his personal belief that everything in the country belonged to the king. It was a small country of only 20,000 square kilometers and a population of 1.5 million people. His people were elephant hunters by tradition, going back to the days when they traded ivory with the Arabs. Of course, the transport of a heavy commodity was always difficult through the jungle 600 years ago. So the establishment of the slave trade used freshly captured slaves to carry the heavy tusks to the ports where both the tusks and their carriers were sold. He swallowed heavy as he finished the statement and cleared his throat. The young prince told me, "It's our custom to name each child after a famous elephant, and hopefully that person will inherit the traits displayed by their namesake. My oldest brother, whom you met, Broken Tusk, is named after a large bull elephant that won many fights and withstood many challenges even after his tusk was broken. Broken Tusk was even the son of the largest tusker known as Jumbo, whom our father is named after. Jumbo lived for many years and withstood all challenges to his leadership. We believed that if we promoted the breeding of the largest tuskers that we would continue to improve the length and size of the tusks of our elephants. At least, that was the justification of our elders. My youngest brother, named Prince Satau Tusk, is named after Kenya's largest tusker, whose tusks were so long, they almost touched the ground. Satau, the elephant, was killed by poachers using a poisoned arrow less than 10 years ago. What was his name? I asked and sensed that Ian had intentionally left that last. Ian slightly smiled when he said, Prince Melon Tusk. Melon was a large bull elephant that would raid crops, and he had a special love of melons. Often, he would be seen with a melon dangling from one of his tusks as he paraded about. I found him quite interesting, and while his brother and father were squandering the money on all types of luxuries, he had two goals: diversify the country's wealth, provide a better life for his people in the future. How is he planning to accomplish those lofty goals? I asked, and Ian replied, he has the oil company lawyers working on a hostile takeover of the Tesla car manufacturing company. What better diversification from fossil fuels but to build electric vehicles? One or both will win out, won't they? Prince Melon's not planning to change anything, but he figures at least one small plant can be built in his home country to satisfy regional vehicle needs but also provide learning careers for his people. The prince is thinking about the future. He has longer-term goals for education and healthcare that I liked, and I thought he was a very sincere fellow. It seemed his interests were the betterment of all his people as well as the wildlife under his care, which includes chimpanzees, gorillas, monkeys, leopards, antelopes, elephants, hippos, crocodiles, and snakes that call his country home. Even insects like the tsetse fly have their place. In another conversation, Ian let me know Dr. Sue mentioned she'd been talking with one of Floren's Russian doctors about chromosomal islands. Chromosomal islands could be a way for bacteria to defend against phage infection. A subtype of chromosomal islands known as phage-inducible chromosomal islands are harvested from bacterial chromosomes on phage infections and can hinder phage replication. Then he said, Floren also told me about this doctor. I think we're going to invest in his research and move him closer to home. Phage-inducible chromosomal islands, or PICIs, are a family of highly mobile genetic elements that contribute to horizontal gene transfer, host adaptation, and virulence. Dr. Sue told me they were found in Staphylococcus aureus, but can occur in gram-positive bacteria. I thought, molecular parasites that exploit key temperate phages as helpers or minions, by using a variety of elegant strategies to manipulate the phage life cycle and promote their own spread, both intra and intergenerically. Amazing, they're not only doing what they do, but they're doing it better than any others. Cheesy would appreciate that. They are the best. Period. The conversation that occurs when more than 3 people gather migrates quickly from cordial to scientific. You can sit down to have a sandwich and a coffee and get a free documentary on one of a dozen topics. Who needs YouTube or Wikipedia? Antibodies are protein components of adaptive immune systems whose function is to bind antigens, or foreign substances in the body, and target them for destruction. Errol said to Dr. Ben because he thought that might help the devil's immune system target the currently unrecognized disease that's killing them. Antibodies can be secreted into the extracellular environment or anchored in the membranes of specialized B cells or plasma cells. Enzymes are limited in their binding affinity for their substrates by the necessity of conducting their reaction. Antibodies don't have those constraints. An antibody's binding affinity to its target is extraordinarily high, Dr. Ben told him. Dr. Sue added additional food for thought. Many ligand transport proteins bind particular small biomolecules and transport them to other locations in the body of any multicellular organisms. Those proteins have a high binding affinity when their ligand is present in high concentrations. The best example of a ligand-binding protein is hemoglobin. Everyone knows it transports oxygen from the lungs to other organs and tissues. Sometimes it's only me sitting alone and the conversation in my head turns to science. How can we measure vital force with the new magnetics? Some traditional cultures still consider ether the fifth element, and believe it plays prominently in the esoteric worlds of magic, mysticism, and the supernatural. Dark ether, along with the mysterious discoveries of dark matter and dark energy, was seen as elusive forces believed to be the cause of the accelerating expansion of this universe at that time. Dr. Ross told us, originally, electricity and magnetism were considered to be two separate forces. That view changed with the publication of Maxwell's A Treatise on Electricity and Magnetism, in which the interactions of positive and negative charges were shown to be mediated by one force. There are four main effects resulting from those interactions. Electric charges attract or repel one another with a force inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Unlike charges attract, like ones repel. Florin uses that to great advantage in the one-eyed Jack performances to give the illusion of them flying. Magnetic poles attract or repel one another in a manner similar to positive and negative charges and always exist as pairs. Every north pole is yoked to a south pole. It's the yin and yang of all things. An electric current inside a wire creates a corresponding circumferential magnetic field outside the wire. Its clockwise or counterclockwise direction depends on the direction of the current in the wire. These things seem so obvious to me now, but I realize it was because I just don't think of you in that way. A current is induced in a loop of wire when it's moved toward or away from a magnetic field, or a magnet is moved towards or away from it. The direction of current depends on that of the movement. So simple and so obvious. The solutions are always elegant, aren't they? That's what we thought when we finally understood some of Mr. Tesla's visions. We had a final bonfire the night before we left and confirmed everyone's plans for the upcoming year. Ian was headed home but coming back to stay. Cheesy was going to Moldavia for a couple months to work with Florin and Dr. Roz. Kim, Jeffrey, and Hamish were looking forward to working with the anti-poaching website. Dr. Sue was making great headway with Anopheles gambiae and Plasmodium, while Dr. Ben had his hands full with his new antivenom laboratory that could save thousands of lives in that part of the country, let alone all of Africa. It was one of those acts that could only have good come of it. Rick was looking forward to getting Dr. Ben's contribution to the neonatal puzzle and learning the secret of the mushrooms. Sandy was heading to the Salton Sea for a month or two to work on his snorkeling park before returning to India. Big Wham was working on her growth studies on high-altitude plants as well as being kept busy with Dr. Sue's requests while supporting the grad students. Jay and Dr. Emily were beginning to gain traction with their DNA studies of lifetime changes as well as gaining some new understanding of vital force thanks to connection with Florin. They were trying to arrange some in-person contact, but Dr. Emily was also anxious to see more of Castle Cell Tradet. Ian was planning to return to Africa to begin a new part of his life and become involved in all the activities of the Pendulum Group as well as direct the Windhaven Medical Clinic. It was a mass exodus the following morning with tearful goodbyes and promises flowing faster than water into the Salton Sea. We arrived back in Tasmania before the new academic year, which gave us plenty of time to take a trip to Halls Falls and investigate events occurring there. The email we received was all we could talk about on the way home from Africa, so we were overjoyed to see Uncle Artis had us packed up and ready to go first thing the next morning. That was the first time Errol and I would see the property they purchased in person. Our only other exposure to it was through the video Travis and Timur shot when they captured the first sight of the Thylacinus cynocephalus family several years ago. Once back in Hobart, we were soon immersed in the business of our new company. Mary had all our desks and schedules chomping at us like restrained pit bulls. It was almost Christmas before any of us could put our heads up. We spent a traditional type of Christmas at Halls Falls and admired the work the boys and uncles had done. Several of their friends were entrenched in the outbuildings monitoring our traps and cameras. They had also set up a thylacine awareness channel to track sightings throughout Tasmania. In the spring we had to aggressively work on our feedies as well as the lab business, but did find a couple of weekends to enjoy new parts of the Tasmania countryside, including Lake Gordon, which was a favourite of Uncle Artis. I'm telling you boys, you're not going to the Salton Sea for the whole summer unless you put a move on some of these files. Dr. David and I will have our hands full as it is. You should be taking me with you. And she would plop a mock pile of papers down on the table and feign being miffed. I wanted to hear details of Darla, Magda and Krista's trip to visit the Countess, but in the months that followed their return, mouths were closed. Magda would only say, "Science boys talk science." We don't. My circumstances in the society of the day could only be described as privileged. Affirmative action was designed to push all my pendulums back to slow my progress down. In my case, they could push all they want and my pendulums were not going to budge. In the society we were living in at the time, Errol was the guy that everyone else saw themselves as disadvantaged by. Not specifically Errol, but because he was a white male. His pendulums could be pushed back and his progress could be hampered. That's what many people thought at the time, and they tried to skew his pendulum against him because he had so many advantages that he utilized to make him the person he was. Was our future best served by holding Errol back? When Errol was young, his father passed away and his mother had to earn a living as well as fulfill the traditional role of mother in her vision of a family she had from her Presbyterian upbringing. She handled the household requirements, worked, and looked after Errol's emotional needs. Uncle Artis filled in as his father figure, providing most things the family needed, including making sure Errol had a sense of responsibility, a work ethic, and wasn't a coward. So a couple of pendulums swung against him. Those aren't ones that would shelter him from the wrath of affirmative action. Errol liked to tell a story of when he was working in the reception room at the brewery where candidates would wait for their job interview. The first person was a young woman, and Errol said to her, "You must have worked very hard to get this interview." And she replied, "Yes, I worked extremely hard against all sorts of obstacles." So naturally Errol replied, "Then you must appreciate the struggle it took to get here. Didn't the lady of color sitting next to you have an even more difficult struggle?" The young lady looked to her left and then back at me and said, "Yes." And she got up and left the interview room. Everyone shifted up a chair in the sequence. Errol asked the same questions of the lady of color, and didn't the Aboriginal lady sitting next to her have more pendulums skewed against her? She replied, "Yes," and she got up and left. Everyone shifted up a chair in the sequence. Errol asked the same questions of the Aboriginal lady, and didn't the handicapped lady sitting in the wheelchair next to her have more pendulums skewed against her? She said, "Yes," and she got up and left. The last person rolled her chair up to the front of the line. Finally, Errol congratulated the lady in the wheelchair and still inquired about her struggle, and she responded, "I don't think I want to work for a company that doesn't hire candidates based on merit. I worked too hard for that," and she left. Errol calls his generation the chip generation. Everyone has a chip on their shoulder, and pendulums are skewed against all of them in all sorts of manners. The bigger the chip, the bigger the skew, the bigger the advantage required to reach equilibrium. Affirmative action must still discriminate against someone to give opportunities to others. Someone who can afford to be discriminated against. Thank goodness Einstein was able to push back the pendulums he faced.